There is a tower that rises above the eastern edge of Kanto, its silhouette dark against the fading light of evening. The structure stands 7 stories tall, built from aged stone and weathered wood, and it carries the weight of something older than the towns that surround it. This is Pokémon Tower, and its presence shapes the quiet settlement of Lavender Town in ways that extend beyond architecture or geography. The tower was built to honor the dead, to provide a resting place for Pokémon whose journeys had ended. Before we drift off, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this, and thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. And as we begin to examine what makes this place feel different from anywhere else in Kanto, we find ourselves drawn first to the foundation itself, to the ground upon which the tower was constructed. The land beneath Pokémon Tower was not always used for burial. Historical records suggest that the site once served a different purpose entirely, functioning as a natural gathering place for wild Pokémon during seasonal migrations. The elevation provided clear sight lines across the surrounding valleys, and the exposed rock formations offered shelter from harsh weather. Ghost-type Pokémon were particularly drawn to this location, appearing in unusual concentrations during the autumn months when fog settled thick across the lowlands. These patterns persisted for generations, creating what some researchers now describe as a spiritual landmark, a place where the boundary between the physical world and something less tangible seemed thinner than elsewhere. When human settlements began to form in the region, the founders of what would become Lavender Town recognized the significance of this site. Rather than building homes or commercial structures on the elevated ground, they chose to preserve it, eventually constructing the tower as a formal memorial space. The decision reflected a cultural understanding that certain locations carry inherent meaning, that the presence of ghost-type Pokémon and the natural atmosphere of the site suggested a purpose beyond ordinary use. The tower's construction took place over several years, with materials sourced from the surrounding forests and quarries, and the final structure incorporated design elements meant to harmonize with the spiritual qualities already present in the landscape. The architecture of Pokémon Tower follows a vertical progression that mirrors traditional memorial structures found throughout eastern Kanto. Each floor serves a distinct function, beginning with the ground-level entrance hall and ascending through multiple chambers dedicated to different aspects of remembrance and ritual. The building materials were chosen for durability and acoustic properties, with thick stone walls that dampen external sounds while allowing the natural resonance of the interior spaces to carry voices and footsteps with unusual clarity. Wooden support beams were harvested from nearby groves and treated with preservatives that have allowed them to endure decades of exposure to moisture and temperature fluctuations, and the result is a structure that feels both permanent and strangely alive. The ground floor of the tower functions as a reception area and initial memorial space. Visitors entering through the main doors find themselves in a large rectangular chamber illuminated by natural light filtering through high windows. The floor is paved with smooth stone tiles that show the wear of countless footsteps, and along the walls are alcoves containing offerings left by trainers honoring their departed Pokémon. Fresh flowers are replaced regularly by town volunteers, and small items of personal significance accumulate in corners and on ledges, creating informal shrines that reflect individual grief and remembrance. The atmosphere on this floor remains relatively calm, with enough foot traffic and natural light to prevent the oppressive heaviness that characterizes the upper levels. A central staircase provides access to the second floor, where the character of the space begins to shift noticeably. The lighting becomes dimmer as windows grow smaller and less frequent, and the stone walls seem to absorb rather than reflect what illumination remains. This floor contains rows of memorial markers, each representing a Pokémon laid to rest within the tower's grounds. The markers vary in size and material, from simple wooden posts to elaborate carved stones, and they are arranged in chronological sections that trace decades of burials. Walking through this level creates a sense of temporal depth, of moving backward through years of accumulated loss, and the silence here feels heavier than on the ground floor, as though sound itself is weighed down by the sheer number of names inscribed on the surrounding surfaces. The transition to the third floor marks a significant atmospheric change. Here, the natural light is almost entirely absent, replaced by flickering candles maintained by tower caretakers and the occasional electric lamp installed in recent years. The memorial markers give way to actual burial chambers, small alcoves carved into the thick stone walls where the remains of Pokémon are interred, along with personal items from their trainers. The temperature drops noticeably on this level, remaining consistently cool regardless of the season outside, and visitors often report a feeling of being watched, though visual confirmation of any presence remains elusive. The architecture of this floor includes narrow corridors that branch off from the main pathway, creating a maze-like quality that can disorient those unfamiliar with the layout. Ghost-type Pokémon appear with increasing frequency, beginning on the third floor. Ghastly are the most common, their gaseous forms drifting through the corridors and occasionally coalescing into semi-visible shapes near the burial alcoves. These Pokémon seem to serve as guardians of sorts, observing visitors without interfering, unless someone attempts to disturb the resting places of the interred. Haunter also manifest on this level, though less frequently, and their presence tends to correlate with moments of heightened emotion from visitors, as though they are drawn to grief or fear. The Pokémon do not attack unprovoked, instead floating at the periphery of human activity, maintaining a presence that feels both protective and unsettling. The fourth floor of Pokémon Tower represents a threshold beyond which casual visitors rarely venture. Access to this level and those above is typically restricted to town elders, volunteer caretakers, and trainers who have received explicit permission to conduct memorial rituals. The restriction exists partly for safety, as the upper floors are structurally less stable than those below, but also because the spiritual activity intensifies significantly at higher elevations. The fourth floor contains no memorial markers or burial chambers, instead functioning as a transitional space filled with ritual objects and ceremonial items accumulated over the tower's history. Incense burns continuously here, the smoke creating thick layers that obscure visibility and add to the dreamlike quality of the environment. The walls on the fourth floor are covered with inscriptions, though not all of them are readily intelligible. Some are names of Pokémon written in formal script, while others appear to be prayers or protective charms composed in archaic language that even local historians struggle to fully translate. The inscriptions were added gradually over many years, each generation of caretakers contributing their own additions, and the resulting palimpsest creates a textual history of the tower's evolution as a memorial site. Certain phrases appear repeatedly, suggesting they hold particular significance in the rituals conducted here, and some inscriptions show signs of having been deliberately obscured or overwritten, hinting at changes in practice or belief that occurred during specific historical periods. Temperature fluctuations on the fourth floor follow no predictable pattern, with some areas remaining unnaturally cold while others radiate warmth that has no apparent source. These microclimates shift over time, with cold zones migrating to different parts of the floor across days or weeks. Researchers attempting to document these phenomena have proposed various explanations, from underground water sources to the presence of specific ghost-type Pokémon whose natural abilities affect their immediate environment. No single theory has gained universal acceptance, and the fluctuations continue to resist systematic analysis, remaining one of the many aspects of the tower that defies straightforward scientific understanding. The fifth floor is where most accounts of supernatural activity originate. This level consists of a single large chamber that occupies the entire footprint of the tower at that height, with a ceiling that rises to meet the underside of the sixth floor. The space is largely empty of furniture or decorative elements, containing only a few wooden benches placed along the perimeter and a central platform raised slightly above the surrounding floor. The platform serves as the focal point for memorial services conducted for particularly significant Pokemon or those whose trainers wish to observe more elaborate ritual practices. Candles ring the platform's edge, and their light creates shifting shadows that seem to move with independent volition, forming shapes that observers frequently describe as resembling Pokemon species, both familiar and unidentifiable. The air on the fifth floor carries a quality that visitors consistently describe as heavy, though not in a purely physical sense. Breathing remains easy, but each inhalation feels weighted with something beyond oxygen and nitrogen, as though the atmosphere itself is saturated with emotion or memory. This sensation intensifies near the center of the room, particularly around the raised platform, and some visitors report feeling a pressure against their chest or a tightness in their throat that eases only after descending to lower levels. The phenomenon affects different people with varying intensity, with children and particularly sensitive individuals experiencing the most pronounced reactions. Ghost type Pokemon manifest more freely on the fifth floor than anywhere else in the tower. Ghastly and Haunter appear in numbers that would be unusual even in specifically haunted locations, and their behavior differs from the passive observation exhibited on lower levels. Here they actively interact with visitors, circling around groups of people, passing through solid objects with deliberate intent, and occasionally making sounds that approximate human speech or Pokemon cries. These interactions rarely escalate to outright aggression, instead maintaining a boundary where the Pokemon assert their presence without directly threatening those who have come to pay respects. The distinction seems intentional, as though the Pokemon are capable of recognizing genuine mourners and responding appropriately to their emotional state. The sixth floor is accessible only by a narrow staircase that begins in an easily overlooked corner of the fifth floor chamber. The stairs are steeper than those connecting lower levels, and the steps themselves show significant wear, their centers hollowed by generations of footfalls. The sixth floor contains what tower records describe as the Elder Memorial Chambers, burial spaces reserved for Pokemon who played particularly significant roles in the history of Lavender Town, or whose trainers achieved notable accomplishments during their lifetimes. The chambers are sealed with stone doors bearing inscribed plaques that identify the Pokemon interred within, along with brief descriptions of their lives and the circumstances of their deaths. The inscriptions on these plaques reveal patterns in how the relationship between humans and Pokemon has evolved over time. Earlier markers emphasize the practical contributions of working Pokemon, describing their roles in agriculture, construction, or defense of the settlement. Later inscriptions shift toward more personal language, focusing on companionship and emotional bonds rather than functional utility. This linguistic evolution mirrors broader cultural changes in how Pokemon are perceived and valued, moving from a predominantly utilitarian framework toward one that recognizes them as individuals worthy of mourning in their own right. The plaques collectively function as a social history written in memorial language, documenting shifts in values and priorities across multiple generations. One particular chamber on the sixth floor has attracted disproportionate attention from researchers and spiritually inclined visitors. The plaque identifies the interred as a Marowak with a death date that corresponds to a specific incident documented in Lavender Town's historical records. The inscription is notably briefer than others on the same floor, containing only the species name, a date, and a single phrase that translates approximately to Guardian of the Young. The brevity has prompted speculation about the circumstances surrounding this particular burial, with some suggesting that the limited information reflects ongoing controversy or unresolved questions about the Marowak's death. The chamber's stone door shows signs of having been opened and resealed multiple times, unusual for memorial spaces that typically remain permanently closed after initial interment. The spiritual activity surrounding this particular chamber exceeds that of any other location within the tower. Visitors report seeing a distinct apparition in the vicinity, described consistently as a humanoid figure approximately 1 meter in height, carrying a bone like object. The apparition manifests most frequently during evening hours and appears to follow a specific patrol route that includes the sixth floor corridor and portions of the fifth floor chamber below. Unlike the more amorphous manifestations of Ghastly and Haunter, this presence maintains a stable visible form for extended periods, allowing for detailed observation. The figure does not interact directly with living visitors, but responds to their presence by altering its movement patterns, sometimes approaching closely enough for fine details to be discerned before fading from visibility. The connection between this apparition and the Marowak buried in the sealed chamber has become a central element of Lavender Town folklore. Local accounts describe the Marowak as having died defending a young Cubone from human attackers, a narrative supported by fragmentary historical records that reference a violent incident involving Pokémon poachers operating in the Lavender Town area during the relevant time period. The Cubone supposedly survived the attack, but never recovered from witnessing its parents' death, remaining in the vicinity of the tower and eventually becoming the source of the ghost sightings reported by subsequent generations of visitors. The story has achieved such widespread acceptance that many residents treat it as established fact rather than speculation, though definitive proof remains elusive. Researchers attempting to verify the Marowak narrative have encountered significant obstacles. Tower records from the relevant period are incomplete, with several years of documentation either lost or deliberately removed. Local government archives contain references to investigations into poaching activity, but provide minimal detail about specific incidents or outcomes. Interviews with elderly residents produce contradictory accounts, with some confirming the basic outline of the story, while others dismiss it as embellishment of a more mundane event. The lack of definitive evidence has not diminished the narrative's cultural power, and the ghost of the Marowak remains the most famous and frequently reported supernatural phenomenon associated with Pokémon Tower. The seventh and highest floor of the tower consists of a single small chamber accessible only through a trapdoor in the sixth floor ceiling. The chamber is barely large enough to accommodate more than 2 or 3 people simultaneously, and its ceiling slopes sharply toward the outer walls, following the pitch of the tower's roof. Natural light enters through a small window that faces east, providing the only illumination in a space too small and isolated for practical installation of artificial lighting. The chamber contains no memorial markers or burial sites, instead functioning as what records describe as a meditation space or final ascension point for particularly dedicated memorial practices. The eastern-facing window holds specific ritual significance related to sunrise observations. Tower caretakers maintain a tradition of ascending to this chamber during specific times of year to witness the dawn, a practice that supposedly dates to the tower's original construction. The ritual is private, shared only among a small group of individuals who have inherited the responsibility through family lineages connected to the tower's founding families. Outsiders are rarely granted access to the seventh floor, and those who have been permitted entry describe an atmosphere of intense concentration and stillness, as though the chamber itself demands a particular quality of attention from those who occupy it. The view from the seventh floor window extends across Lavender Town and the surrounding landscape, providing a perspective unavailable from ground level. On clear mornings, the sunrise illuminates the town's distinctive purple-tinted architecture and casts long shadows from the tower across the cemetery grounds below. The visual alignment between the window and specific landmarks in the distance suggests intentional architectural planning, with the tower's orientation chosen to facilitate particular sightlines. Some researchers have proposed that these alignments correspond to astronomical phenomena or seasonal markers, significant in traditional Kanto spiritual practices, though definitive proof of such correlations remains subject to ongoing investigation. The cemetery surrounding Pokémon Tower extends outward from the building's base in irregular sections that reflect different periods of expansion. The oldest graves cluster nearest the tower, marked by weathered stones that have lost much of their original detail to decades of erosion. These early burial sites are notably smaller than those in newer sections, suggesting changes in memorial customs or perhaps differences in the species of Pokemon being interred. The arrangement follows no obvious geometric pattern, instead appearing almost organic, as though the graves were placed according to criteria that prioritized spiritual rather than aesthetic considerations. Vegetation within the cemetery exhibits unusual growth patterns that have attracted attention from botanists and ecologists. Certain plant species thrive here, despite conditions that would typically limit their development, while others struggle to establish themselves even when soil quality and sun exposure seem adequate. The most notable example involves a particular variety of white flowering plant that appears nowhere else in Kanto, growing exclusively in the oldest sections of the cemetery and blooming during a narrow window in late autumn. Local tradition associates these flowers with the presence of ghost-type Pokémon, claiming they only grow where spiritual energy reaches sufficient concentration. Scientific analysis of the plants has revealed nothing that would explain their restricted distribution, though their genetic makeup shows subtle variations from related species found in other regions. The cemetery grounds serve as habitat for numerous wild Pokémon, with ghost types comprising the majority of the resident population. Ghastly are ubiquitous, appearing throughout the grounds during nighttime hours and occasionally during overcast days when ambient light levels drop sufficiently. Haunter are less common, but still regularly observed, particularly in areas with dense tree cover or near the tower's base, where shadows persist even during midday. Gengar sightings are rare and typically occur only during periods of heightened supernatural activity, such as certain lunar phases or anniversary dates connected to significant events in the tower's history. The ghost-type Pokémon inhabiting the cemetery exhibit behaviors that differ from those observed in wild populations elsewhere. They show reduced territoriality and minimal aggressive response to human presence, provided visitors demonstrate appropriate respect for the memorial nature of the site. The Pokémon seem to function as informal guardians, maintaining a presence that deters vandalism or disrespectful behavior while allowing genuine mourners to conduct their visits undisturbed. This protective function appears to be self-organized rather than directed by human caretakers, suggesting a level of collective purpose among the Pokémon that exceeds typical wild behavior patterns. Non-ghost type Pokémon also inhabit the cemetery grounds, though in smaller numbers. Grass types are particularly common, with species such as Oddish and Bellsprout establishing populations among the vegetation that grows between grave markers. These Pokémon benefit from the generally undisturbed nature of the cemetery, which provides habitat free from the intensive human activity that characterizes more developed areas of Lavender Town. Some residents believe the presence of these normal type species helps balance the spiritual intensity of the location, introducing vitality and growth to counteract the associations with death and loss that otherwise dominate the site. The maintenance of Pokémon Tower and its surrounding cemetery falls primarily to a volunteer organization composed of Lavender Town residents who have inherited the responsibility through family tradition or chosen to participate based on personal connection to the site. The volunteers conduct regular cleaning of the tower's interior, replace candles and incense, repair damaged memorial markers, and maintain the grounds by managing vegetation growth and addressing structural issues as they arise. The work is performed without compensation and requires significant time commitment, yet the organization maintains consistent membership across generations, suggesting deep cultural investment in the tower's preservation. Volunteer caretakers follow specific protocols when working within the tower, particularly on the upper floors where supernatural activity is most pronounced. These protocols include announcing one's presence upon entering each level, maintaining respectful silence except when conducting necessary communication, and avoiding direct confrontation with any ghost type Pokemon encountered during work activities. Caretakers learn these practices through apprenticeship with more experienced volunteers, and the knowledge is transmitted orally rather than through written documentation. The emphasis on oral tradition reflects a belief that certain aspects of tower caretaking cannot be adequately captured in text, requiring instead direct experience and mentorship to fully understand. The financial support for tower maintenance comes from multiple sources, including donations from visitors, subsidies from Lavender Town's municipal government, and occasional grants from regional historical preservation organizations. The tower holds official designation as a cultural heritage site, which provides access to certain funding streams while also imposing restrictions on modifications or renovations that might compromise historical integrity. The designation reflects recognition that Pokémon Tower represents more than a local memorial, functioning instead as a significant example of Kanto's memorial architecture and an important repository of cultural practices related to death and remembrance. Architectural assessments conducted over the years have identified various structural concerns that require ongoing attention to prevent deterioration. The tower's foundation shows signs of settling, with minor cracks appearing in basement walls and slight tilting measurable in certain sections of the upper floors. Moisture infiltration remains a persistent challenge, particularly during heavy rainfall when water finds its way through gaps in the roof and runs down interior walls, accelerating decay of wooden structural elements. The stone construction has proved remarkably durable, but individual blocks occasionally require replacement when erosion or freeze-thaw cycles cause significant damage. These maintenance needs create ongoing financial pressure that the volunteer organization and municipal government work collaboratively to address. The cultural significance of Pokémon Tower extends beyond its function as a memorial site to encompass its role in shaping Lavender Town's identity and character. The tower's presence influences the town's aesthetic, with many buildings constructed in architectural styles that complement rather than compete with the memorial structure. The town's economy incorporates the tower as both a practical consideration and a symbolic element, with businesses catering to visitors who come to pay respects, while also serving residents for whom the tower represents an integral part of daily life. This dual function creates a unique economic ecosystem where memorial-related commerce coexists with ordinary municipal activity. Tourism related to Pokémon Tower follows seasonal patterns, with peak visitation occurring during autumn months when traditional memorial observances are most common. Visitors arrive from throughout Kanto and occasionally from other regions, drawn by personal connections to Pokémon interred within the tower or by interest in the site's spiritual and historical significance. The town has developed infrastructure to accommodate these visitors, including lodging facilities, restaurants, and shops selling memorial supplies and locally produced goods. This tourism generates essential revenue for the town's economy while also creating tension around the appropriate balance between commercial activity and the solemn character that residents believe should define Lavender Town's public identity. The relationship between Lavender Town's residents and Pokémon Tower is complex and multifaceted, varying significantly across demographic groups and individual circumstances. For older residents and those with family histories deeply rooted in the town, the tower represents continuity with the past and a tangible connection to ancestors who helped establish the community. These residents tend to view the tower with reverence and take personal pride in its maintenance and preservation. Younger residents and recent arrivals often hold more ambivalent attitudes, appreciating the tower's historical importance while sometimes feeling constrained by its influence on the town's cultural and economic development. Educational programs centered on Pokémon Tower serve multiple functions within Lavender Town's school system. Students learn about the tower's history as part of local studies curriculum, with lessons covering architectural features, memorial practices, and the broader cultural context that gave rise to such structures throughout Kanto. Field trips to the tower provide direct experience with memorial traditions and exposure to concepts of death and remembrance at age appropriate levels. Some educators report that these programs help students develop more mature understandings of mortality and loss, though parents occasionally object to the emphasis on death related topics in educational settings designed primarily for young children. The tower also functions as a research site for academics, studying various aspects of Kanto history, architecture, religious practices, and paranormal phenomena. Archaeologists examine the building techniques used in the tower's construction and compare them to other memorial structures from the same period. Anthropologists document memorial rituals and analyze how they reflect and reinforce cultural values related to the relationship between humans and Pokemon. Parapsychologists attempt to measure and categorize the supernatural phenomena reported by visitors, employing various technological instruments and research methodologies to capture data about manifestations that resist conventional scientific analysis. Research conducted at Pokémon Tower has contributed to broader academic understanding of several topics beyond the specific site itself. Studies of the ghost-type Pokémon populations have yielded insights into species behavior, habitat preferences, and social organization patterns that inform conservation efforts and policy decisions related to ghost-type management throughout Kanto. Architectural documentation has preserved detailed information about construction methods that might otherwise have been lost as traditional building knowledge fades from active practice. The tower functions as a living archive where historical information remains embedded in physical structures and ongoing cultural practices rather than existing solely in written records or museum displays. The acoustic properties of Pokémon Tower have been subject to particular scientific interest. The stone construction and vertical architecture create unusual sound propagation patterns, with certain frequencies amplified while others are dampened. Voices speaking on upper floors can sometimes be heard with surprising clarity on lower levels, while sounds originating outside the tower rarely penetrate the thick walls. These properties were likely intentional design features chosen to enhance the ritual effectiveness of memorial ceremonies conducted within the tower. Modern acoustic analysis has confirmed that the interior spaces possess resonance characteristics well suited to chanting, prayer, and other vocalization practices common in memorial contexts. The electromagnetic environment within Pokémon Tower deviates measurably from normal background levels, with instruments detecting fluctuations that correlate with reports of supernatural activity. The fluctuations do not follow predictable patterns, instead varying in intensity and frequency across different time scales, ranging from minutes to months. Researchers have proposed various explanations, including the presence of ghost-type Pokémon whose natural abilities produce electromagnetic effects, geological features beneath the tower that generate anomalous fields, or even psychological factors that influence both subjective experience of supernatural events and the readings of detection equipment. No single explanation has achieved consensus, and the electromagnetic anomalies remain an active area of investigation. Temperature monitoring throughout the tower has documented the microclimatic variations that visitors frequently report. The data confirms that certain areas maintain temperatures significantly below ambient levels with no apparent heating or cooling source, while other zones exhibit warmth that cannot be attributed to sunlight, human activity, or building systems. The cold zones correlate partially, but not perfectly, with areas of reported supernatural activity, suggesting a relationship between temperature and spiritual phenomena that is more complex than simple cause and effect. Seasonal variations affect the magnitude but not the location of temperature anomalies, with cold zones becoming more pronounced during winter months while remaining spatially consistent across the annual cycle. The relationship between Pokémon Tower and the broader Lavender Town community involves ongoing negotiation around appropriate use of the memorial space. Some residents advocate for preserving the tower exclusively for memorial purposes, resisting any commercialization or casual visitation that might compromise its spiritual character. Others argue for more open access, believing that broader engagement with the tower strengthens community connection to the site and ensures its long term preservation through wider public investment. These debates that typically intensify during planning discussions about tower maintenance projects, visitor management policies, or proposals for educational and interpretive programs that would increase public interaction with the site. The tower's influence on Lavender Town's cultural production is substantial and varied. Local artists frequently incorporate tower imagery into their work, producing paintings, sculptures, and crafts that reference its distinctive silhouette and memorial significance. Musicians compose pieces inspired by the tower's atmosphere and the stories associated with it, creating a regional musical tradition characterized by minor keys and contemplative tempos. Writers contribute to a growing body of literature centered on the tower, ranging from historical accounts to fictional narratives that use the building as a setting for ghost stories and supernatural mysteries. Seasonal festivals in Lavender Town often incorporate elements related to Pokémon Tower and memorial practices. The Autumn Memorial Festival is the most significant annual event, featuring processions to the tower, group memorial services, and cultural performances that honor the dead and celebrate the bonds between humans and Pokémon. The festival attracts participants from throughout Kanto, creating a temporary population surge that strains municipal infrastructure while generating essential economic activity. The event blends solemn memorial observances with more celebratory cultural expressions, creating a complex emotional atmosphere that residents describe as uniquely characteristic of Lavender Town's approach to remembering the dead. The tower's presence also affects property values throughout Lavender Town, though the relationship is complex and varies by location. Properties adjacent to the cemetery generally sell for less than comparable homes in other neighborhoods, reflecting buyer reluctance to live in immediate proximity to a burial ground. However, properties with views of the tower from a slight distance can command premium prices, as some buyers value the aesthetic appeal of the historic structure and the sense of living in a town with distinctive character. The economic calculus of tower proximity reflects broader cultural attitudes about death, memorial spaces, and the appropriate relationship between the living and the dead. The role of Pokémon Tower in individual and family memorial practices extends beyond the simple interment of deceased Pokémon to encompass ongoing rituals of remembrance and connection. Families return to the tower on anniversary dates, bringing fresh flowers and spending time in contemplation near the burial sites of Pokémon they have lost. Some maintain multi-generational relationships with specific grave sites, honoring Pokémon that belong to parents or grandparents, and thereby creating continuity across family history. These practices transform the tower from a static repository of the dead into an active site of memory work where the past remains present through repeated acts of commemoration. The psychological impact of Pokémon Tower on visitors varies considerably based on individual circumstances and emotional states. For those actively grieving recent losses, the tower can provide crucial symbolic space for processing difficult emotions and finding meaning in death. The formal memorial structure offers a framework for grief that some people find helpful, particularly those who struggle with less structured emotional experiences. Conversely, individuals with unresolved trauma related to loss sometimes find the tower overwhelming. Its concentrated atmosphere of death and remembrance, triggering intense emotional reactions that require support to manage safely. Children visiting Pokémon Tower often process the experience differently than adults, responding to the physical space and visible elements, rather than engaging deeply with abstract concepts of mortality and memorial. Many children are fascinated by the ghost type Pokemon, treating encounters with Ghastly and Haunter as exciting rather than frightening. This response sometimes concerns parents who worry about children developing inappropriate attitudes toward death, though child development specialists generally view such reactions as age appropriate engagement with unfamiliar phenomena rather than evidence of emotional maladjustment. The tower's educational function includes informal lessons about the natural life cycle and the inevitability of death that formal schooling sometimes avoids addressing directly. Parents bringing children to memorialize family Pokemon often use the visit as an opportunity to discuss mortality, loss, and remembrance in concrete terms anchored to specific experiences. These conversations, conducted in the tower's physical space with visual evidence of memorial practices surrounding them, can be formative moments in children's developing understanding of death and their relationship to deceased individuals. The tower thus serves pedagogical purposes that extend beyond its primary memorial function. The relationship between Pokémon Tower and the Pokémon League system reflects broader questions about how competitive battling culture engages with the mortality of the creatures that participate in battles. While modern Pokémon battles rarely result in death due to advances in medical care and safety protocols, the historical record contains numerous examples of Pokémon dying from battle-related injuries. Some of these Pokémon are interred in Pokémon Tower, their graves marked with inscriptions identifying them as battle casualties. The presence of these graves creates implicit critique of battling culture, raising questions about the ethics of training Pokemon for combat and the responsibility trainers bear for the well-being of creatures under their care. Trainers visiting Pokemon Tower sometimes experience the visit as a moment of reckoning with the potential consequences of their chosen path. Seeing the graves of Pokemon who died in battle or from battle-related complications can prompt reflection on training practices, battle strategies, and the underlying motivations for pursuing competitive success. Some trainers report that visiting the tower strengthened their commitment to careful training and ethical treatment of their Pokemon, while others found the experience sufficiently disturbing to reconsider their involvement in competitive battling altogether. The tower thus functions as a kind of ethical mirror, reflecting back to trainers the potential outcomes of the activities they pursue. The tower's influence on Pokemon training culture extends to the development of healing items and medical techniques designed to prevent battle deaths. The concentrated reminder of mortality that the tower provides has motivated innovation in Pokemon healthcare, with researchers and item developers explicitly citing the tower as inspiration for their work. For their modern revive items and full healing potions represent technological responses to the deaths memorialized within the tower, attempting to ensure that future generations of Pokemon can participate in battles without facing the ultimate consequence that befell their predecessors. This connection between memorial space and healthcare innovation demonstrates how sites of death can catalyze efforts to preserve life. The legal framework governing Pokémon Tower addresses both its status as a memorial site and the unique challenges posed by its supernatural characteristics. Local ordinances protect the tower from most forms of development or modification, requiring special permission for any work beyond routine maintenance. The regulations include provisions related to the ghost type Pokemon that inhabit the tower and cemetery, prohibiting attempts to capture or remove them without explicit authorization from town officials. These protections reflect recognition that the Pokemon are integral to the site's character and function, not merely incidental inhabitants that can be relocated at human convenience. Enforcement of tower related regulations requires balancing respect for memorial functions against practical necessities of safety and order. Officials occasionally must intervene when visitors behave inappropriately, whether through vandalism, disturbing memorial items, or attempting to capture ghost type Pokemon despite the prohibitions. These interventions are handled with sensitivity to the emotional nature of memorial spaces, with officials trained to de escalate situations while maintaining appropriate protection of the site. The specialized training reflects broader recognition that memorial spaces require different policing approaches than typical public locations. The tower has been the site of several high profile incidents that shaped public perception and policy around supernatural phenomena in Kanto. One particularly significant event involved a criminal organization attempting to exploit the tower's ghost type Pokemon population for commercial purposes, an operation that was ultimately disrupted through intervention by local trainers. The incident prompted legislative changes strengthening protections for memorial sites and the Pokemon that inhabit them, while also raising broader questions about the commodification of supernatural phenomena and the ethics of capturing Pokemon from spiritually significant locations. The media coverage of Pokémon Tower has contributed to its reputation extending far beyond Lavender Town to encompass regional and even international awareness. Documentaries about haunted locations frequently feature the tower, presenting it as among the most authentically supernatural sites in Kanto. These media representations vary in quality and accuracy, with some providing thoughtful exploration of the tower's history and cultural significance, while others sensationalize supernatural aspects for entertainment value. Residents express mixed feelings about this coverage, appreciating the attention and tourism it generates, while worrying about misrepresentation and the attraction of visitors more interested in ghost hunting than genuine memorial observance. The tower's appearance in popular culture extends to fictional media, where it serves as inspiration for settings in novels, films, and games. These fictional representations typically amplify the supernatural elements while simplifying or altering the historical and cultural context, creating versions of the tower that bear limited resemblance to the actual structure. Some residents object to these fictional adaptations, viewing them as disrespectful appropriation of a sacred space for commercial entertainment. Others see the fictional versions as separate entities that do not diminish the real tower, instead potentially generating interest that brings visitors who might not otherwise have discovered Lavender Town. The relationship between Pokémon Tower and religious or spiritual belief systems in Kanto is complex and not easily categorized. The tower does not align with any single organized religion, instead incorporating elements from multiple spiritual traditions into a syncretic memorial practice that emphasizes connection between the living and the dead. Some visitors approach the tower from explicitly religious perspectives, conducting prayers or rituals according to their faith traditions. Others engage with the site in more secular terms, viewing memorial practices as cultural rather than religious observances. The tower accommodates both approaches, functioning as a flexible space that can be interpreted through various spiritual and philosophical frameworks. The presence of ghost-type Pokemon at the tower has theological implications that different belief systems interpret differently. Some traditions view the Pokemon as literal souls of the dead, while others understand them as natural creatures that happen to thrive in environments saturated with death and memory. These different interpretations lead to varying practices around interaction with the Pokemon, with some visitors offering food or items to the ghosts in quasi religious gestures, while others simply observe them as interesting fauna inhabiting an unusual ecosystem. The tower does not enforce any particular theological interpretation, allowing visitors to bring their own beliefs to their experience of the site. The memorial practices conducted at Pokémon Tower have evolved over time, reflecting changes in broader cultural attitudes about death, remembrance, and the relationship between humans and Pokémon. Early memorial services emphasized formal ritual and collective observance, with community gatherings marking significant deaths and anniversary dates. Contemporary practices have become more individualized, with families and trainers conducting private memorial visits according to personal preferences rather than standardized protocols. This shift mirrors broader cultural trends toward personalization of death rituals and movement away from one size fits all approaches to mourning and remembrance. The tower's caretakers maintain records of memorial services conducted within the building, creating an archive that documents thousands of individual deaths and the human responses to those losses. These records are not fully public, but can be accessed with appropriate permission, providing researchers with primary source material for understanding how memorial practices have changed across generations. The records also serve practical functions, helping caretakers track which burial sites receive regular visitation and which have been abandoned. Information that informs decisions about long term maintenance priorities and potential reuse of space within the tower and cemetery grounds. The concept of proper burial for Pokemon has been debated throughout Kanto's history, with different regions and communities developing varying practices. Pokémon Tower represents one approach, emphasizing formal interment in dedicated memorial spaces with ongoing maintenance and commemoration. Other communities favor cremation, scattering of remains in natural environments, or even return of deceased Pokémon to the wild, where their bodies can nourish other organisms. These different practices reflect varying beliefs about what constitutes respectful treatment of dead Pokémon and what relationship the living should maintain with physical remains. The environmental impact of Pokemon burial practices has received increasing attention from ecologists and environmental scientists. Traditional interment in cemeteries creates concentrated areas where decomposing organic matter affects soil chemistry and local ecosystems. In the case of Pokemon Tower's cemetery, the density of burials has created soil conditions markedly different from surrounding areas, with elevated levels of certain minerals and compounds that affect plant growth and attract specific fauna. These environmental modifications are not necessarily harmful, but they do represent human-caused alterations to natural systems that merit consideration in broader discussions of sustainable death practices. Alternative memorial options have emerged in recent years as supplements or replacements for traditional tower burial. Cremation, with scattering of ashes in meaningful locations, has gained popularity among trainers who prefer less formal memorial practices. Memorial gardens dedicated specifically to Pokemon have been established in several Kanto cities, offering burial options for residents who live far from Lavender Town or prefer different memorial aesthetics. Digital memorials have also appeared, with websites and apps allowing trainers to create virtual shrines for deceased Pokemon complete with photos, stories, and space for others to leave condolences. These innovations reflect evolving attitudes about memorial practices and the search for approaches that feel meaningful in contemporary cultural contexts. Despite the availability of alternatives, Pokémon Tower maintains its position as the premier memorial site in Kanto, attracting trainers and families who value its historical significance, spiritual atmosphere, and the sense of connection it provides to generations of previous mourners. The tower's endurance as a cultural institution suggests that physical memorial spaces retain importance even as digital and alternative options proliferate. The human need for tangible places to conduct remembrance work appears resistant to complete virtualization, with many people continuing to value the ability to visit a specific location and perform concrete memorial actions like placing flowers or lighting candles. The tower's role in grief counseling and therapeutic interventions for individuals struggling with loss of Pokémon has been recognized by mental health professionals working in Kanto. Some therapists bring clients to the tower as part of structured grief work, using the physical space and memorial practices as anchors for processing difficult emotions. The therapeutic value of the tower derives partly from its explicit acknowledgement that Pokemon death is worthy of formal mourning, countering cultural messages that sometimes minimize or dismiss grief over animal or Pokemon deaths. The tower provides external validation for feelings that grieving individuals might otherwise struggle to justify or express. Group memorial services conducted at the tower create opportunities for shared grief that can be particularly valuable for individuals who feel isolated in their loss. Meeting others who have experienced similar bereavements and witnessing their memorial practices can normalize grief and provide models for working through difficult emotions. The tower facilitates these encounters by bringing together people who might never otherwise meet, creating temporary communities of mourning that offer mutual support and understanding. These spontaneous connections sometimes develop into lasting relationships as individuals maintain contact beyond their initial meeting at the tower. The tower's capacity to accommodate different types of loss and mourning makes it unusually flexible as a memorial space. While primarily designed for Pokemon burial, the tower has occasionally hosted memorial services for humans who died under circumstances involving Pokemon or whose lives were particularly dedicated to Pokemon care and training. These human memorials are not standard practice and require special permission, but their occasional occurrence demonstrates the tower's adaptability to community needs that fall outside its primary purpose. The willingness to accommodate exceptional cases while maintaining focus on Pokemon Memorial reflects a pragmatic approach to the tower's governance. The preservation of Pokemon Tower for future generations requires addressing challenges, both physical and cultural. The physical structure needs ongoing maintenance to prevent deterioration, requiring sustained financial investment and technical expertise. The cultural preservation is perhaps more complex, involving transmission of memorial practices, historical knowledge, and the values that make the tower meaningful to each new generation. Young people must develop a personal connection to the tower and choose to maintain it as a living memorial site rather than allowing it to become a mere historical artifact or tourist attraction. Educational programs targeting youth aim to foster this connection by involving young people directly in tower activities. Student volunteers assist with maintenance work, participate in memorial services, and learn about the tower's history through structured programs designed to build appreciation for its cultural significance. These programs emphasize experiential learning, recognizing that abstract lessons about memorial practices are less effective than direct participation in the ongoing life of the tower. Early results suggest that youth who participate in these programs develop stronger attachment to the tower and express greater interest in continuing memorial traditions. The tower's future may involve technological integration that enhances rather than replaces traditional memorial practices. Digital documentation of grave sites could make information more accessible to distant family members while preserving fragile physical markers from handling and exposure. Virtual reality experiences might allow people who cannot physically visit the tower to participate in memorial services remotely. These technological additions raise questions about authenticity and the nature of memorial experience, prompting ongoing discussion about how innovation can serve memorial purposes without compromising the aspects of physical presence and direct engagement that many people value. The relationship between Pokémon Tower and climate change reflects broader environmental challenges facing heritage sites throughout Kanto. Changing weather patterns affect the tower's physical structure through altered precipitation, temperature fluctuations, and extreme weather events that accelerate deterioration. The cemetery grounds face their own climate related challenges, with shifting growing seasons affecting plant communities and extreme heat or drought stressing vegetation that plays important aesthetic and ecological roles. Adapting to these changes requires both reactive maintenance to address damage and proactive planning to increase resilience against future environmental pressures. The tower's symbolic significance extends beyond its physical presence to encompass what it represents about the relationship between humans and Pokemon. The decision to construct and maintain a formal memorial space for Pokemon deaths reflects a cultural commitment to recognizing Pokemon as beings worthy of mourning, not merely as tools or resources to be used and discarded. This commitment challenges utilitarian frameworks that reduce Pokemon to their functional value, instead asserting that they possess inherent worth that persists beyond their usefulness to human purposes. The tower stands as architectural argument for a particular ethical stance regarding Pokemon, one that influences how people throughout Kanto think about their responsibilities to the creatures they train and live alongside. The economic model supporting Pokemon Tower's operation faces ongoing challenges related to maintaining financial sustainability while preserving the site's memorial character. Increased commercialization could generate necessary revenue, but might compromise the solemn atmosphere that makes the tower meaningful to many visitors. Conversely, excessive restriction of commercial activity could leave the tower financially vulnerable and unable to fund essential maintenance. Finding the appropriate balance requires constant negotiation among stakeholders with different priorities and values, a process that has produced various compromises over the years, but no permanent resolution to underlying tensions. The tower's governance structure involves multiple entities, including Lavender Town Municipal Government, the Volunteer Caretaker Organization, regional heritage preservation agencies, and various community groups with interests in memorial practices or ghost-type Pokemon conservation. This distributed governance creates opportunities for broad participation and prevents any single entity from exercising unchecked control, but it also complicates decision-making and can produce conflicts when different stakeholders disagree about appropriate policies. Recent years have seen efforts to formalize coordination mechanisms and create clearer decision-making processes that maintain collaborative governance while improving efficiency. International attention to Pokémon Tower has grown as scholars and enthusiasts from other regions become aware of its unique characteristics. Researchers from outside Kanto visit to study the tower's architecture, memorial practices, and supernatural phenomena, contributing comparative perspectives that help contextualize Lavender Town's approach to Pokemon burial within broader global patterns. Some international visitors arrive on pilgrimage, having heard about the tower through media coverage or personal networks, and feeling drawn to experience its spiritual atmosphere firsthand. This international dimension has expanded the tower's cultural significance beyond its local and regional importance to position it as a site of global interest. The tower's relationships with academic institutions has produced collaborative research projects that advance scholarly understanding while providing practical benefits to tower preservation. University partnerships have funded structural assessments, environmental monitoring, and conservation treatments that the volunteer organization could not afford independently. In exchange, researchers gain access to a unique field site that offers opportunities for investigation across multiple disciplines. These partnerships and demonstrate how academic research and community heritage preservation can be mutually beneficial when structured thoughtfully with attention to the needs and concerns of all parties involved. The question of who has the right to tell the tower's story and interpret its meaning remains contentious. Local residents who have lived with the tower throughout their lives claim intimate knowledge and cultural authority that outsiders cannot match. Academic researchers bring methodological rigor and comparative frameworks that can reveal aspects of the tower that local familiarity might obscure. Media creators seek to make the tower accessible to broad audiences through narrative forms that may simplify or dramatize. These different storytelling modes serve different purposes and reach different audiences, and the tower's meaning emerges from the interaction among these various narratives rather than from any single authoritative account. The tower's presence in popular imagination sometimes diverges significantly from its lived reality as experienced by Lavender Town residents. Media representations emphasizing supernatural horror create expectations that may not align with the actual experience of visiting, which many people describe as peaceful or melancholic rather than frightening. This gap between representation and reality can lead to disappointment among visitors, expecting dramatic supernatural encounters, while occasionally producing pleasant surprise among those who feared the tower would be too disturbing to visit comfortably. Managing these expectation gaps requires clear communication about what visitors are likely to experience, though the inherently subjective nature of encounters with memorial and potentially supernatural spaces means individual experiences will always vary. The tower's influence on Lavender Town's demographic composition is subtle but measurable, affecting who chooses to live in the town and who decides to leave. Some people are attracted specifically by the tower's presence, valuing the spiritual atmosphere and cultural richness it brings to the community. Others find living in close proximity to a massive memorial structure psychologically burdensome and choose to relocate to towns without such prominent death related landmarks. These individual decisions and aggregate into patterns that shape the town's overall population characteristics, though isolating the tower's specific influence from other factors affecting residential choice is methodologically challenging. The relationship between Pokémon Tower and local business development reflects broader tensions around appropriate economic activity in communities defined by memorial sites. Business owners must navigate between capitalizing on visitor traffic the tower generates and maintaining respect for the memorial nature of the site. Some businesses lean into memorial themes, offering services and products specifically designed for tower visitors, while others deliberately distance themselves from death related associations, emphasizing instead the town's other cultural and natural attractions. This variation creates diverse commercial landscape that accommodates different visitor needs and preferences while reflecting ongoing community debate about Lavender Town's identity and economic future. The tower's role in regional tourism networks positions it as a distinctive attraction that differentiates Lavender Town from competing destinations. Tourism marketing materials highlight the tower's historical significance, architectural interest, and spiritual atmosphere, appealing to travelers seeking cultural experiences rather than entertainment or recreation. This positioning attracts particular visitor demographics while potentially excluding others who prefer more conventional tourist activities. The strategic choice to emphasize cultural and memorial tourism reflects both the tower's actual characteristics and broader community preferences about what kind of visitors Lavender Town wishes to host. The intersection of ghost-type Pokémon research and memorial practice at Pokémon Tower creates unique opportunities for scientific investigation that respects cultural significance. Researchers studying ghost-type behavior, ecology, or evolution can access concentrated populations while working within frameworks that honor the memorial purpose of the site. This requires careful negotiation of research protocols to ensure scientific activities do not disturb memorial practices or disrespect the dead. Successful collaborations have produced valuable scientific insights while maintaining the tower's primary function as a memorial space, demonstrating that knowledge production and cultural preservation can coexist when approached thoughtfully. The tower's acoustic signature has been recorded and analyzed by musicians interested in incorporating its unique sonic qualities into musical compositions. The building's resonance characteristics produce distinctive reverb and harmonic effects that have inspired experimental compositions exploring themes of memory, loss, and the boundary between life and death. These musical projects introduce the tower to audiences who might never visit physically, creating alternate modes of engagement with the site's meaning and atmosphere. The artistic interpretations, sometimes controversy among residents who question whether such creative use of the tower appropriately respects its memorial function or trivializes death and grief for aesthetic purposes. The preservation of ghost-type Pokémon populations at Pokémon Tower requires balancing conservation goals against the natural dynamics of wild populations. The Pokémon are not captive and therefore cannot be managed with the precision possible in controlled environments. Caretakers instead focus on maintaining habitat quality, minimizing disturbances, and monitoring population trends to detect potential problems. This hands-off approach reflects both practical limitations on what can be accomplished with wild ghost types and philosophical commitments to allowing the Pokémon to exist as independently as possible rather than being heavily managed to serve human purposes. The tower's influence on ghost-type Pokémon training practices throughout Kanto is substantial, with many trainers visiting specifically to encounter and potentially capture wild ghost types. The captures are regulated to prevent overexploitation, with limits on how many Pokémon can be taken from the site during specific time periods. These regulations attempt to balance trainer access to valuable training opportunities against conservation needs and respect for the memorial context. Enforcement challenges arise from the difficulty of monitoring all capture attempts in a large, complex building with numerous entry points and secluded areas where unauthorized capturing might occur undetected. The ethical questions surrounding capture of ghost-type Pokémon from memorial sites have no simple answers. Some argue that removing Pokémon from a place they have chosen to inhabit is inherently disrespectful to both the Pokémon and the memorial site. Others contend that ghost types at the tower are simply wild Pokémon that happen to love in an unusual location, and that capture for training purposes is no different ethically than capturing Pokémon from any other habitat. These competing perspectives reflect broader philosophical disagreements about Pokémon autonomy, human rights to capture and train Pokémon, and the appropriate relationship between humans and wild Pokémon populations. The tower's connection to specific legendary and mythological narratives in Kanto culture enriches its meaning beyond the observable facts of its history and function. Stories about the tower's founding involve supernatural elements and legendary figures whose historical existence cannot be verified, but whose narrative presence shapes how people understand the site. These stories are not treated as literal truth by most contemporary residents, but neither are they dismissed as mere fiction. Instead, they occupy a middle category of meaningful narrative that conveys cultural values and historical memory through symbolic rather than factual means. One particularly widespread narrative describes the tower's foundation as having been blessed by a powerful ghost-type Pokémon or spirit that approved of the human intention to create a memorial space. This founding blessing supposedly explains why ghost-type Pokémon gather at the tower and why supernatural phenomena occur with unusual frequency and intensity. The narrative provides a cosmological framework for understanding the tower's distinctive characteristics, positioning it not as an ordinary building that happens to have become haunted, but as a sacred space intentionally designated for spiritual purposes from its inception. The relationship between historical fact and cultural narrative at Pokémon Tower illustrates broader patterns in how communities construct meaning around significant sites. Factual historical records provide partial information about the tower's construction and use, but they cannot capture the subjective experience of memorial practice or the emotional resonance the site holds for those who have mourned there. Cultural narratives fill these gaps, providing frameworks for understanding and transmitting meaning that factual accounts alone cannot achieve. The tower's full significance emerges from the interaction between documented history and cultural story, each mode of knowledge contributing essential elements to collective understanding. The tower's future evolution will depend on decisions made by current and upcoming generations about how to balance preservation, adaptation, and innovation. Strict preservation of historical practices and physical structures risks making the tower increasingly irrelevant to contemporary life, while excessive modification might compromise the characteristics that make it culturally significant. The challenge lies in identifying which elements are essential to preserve and which can be adapted to serve contemporary needs without losing fundamental character. These decisions will determine whether Pokémon Tower remains a vital part of Kanto culture or gradually becomes a fossilized remnant of historical practices that no longer resonate with living communities. The educational potential of Pokémon Tower extends beyond local and regional audiences to encompass global learning about memorial practices, human Pokémon relationships, and the cultural diversity of death rituals. International educational programs could use the tower as a case study for exploring how different cultures approach death and remembrance, comparing Lavender Town's practices with memorial traditions from around the world. Digital resources could make information about the tower accessible to students and educators globally, supporting cross-cultural learning that builds understanding and appreciation for diverse approaches to fundamental human experiences. The tower's role in shaping individual identity and life trajectory becomes apparent in stories of people whose encounters with the site proved personally transformative. Some individuals report that visiting the tower during periods of grief helped them process loss and find paths toward healing. Others describe the tower as inspiring career choices, leading them to pursue work in fields related to Pokémon care, grief counseling, or cultural preservation. These personal transformation narratives demonstrate how physical spaces can catalyze significant life changes, serving as settings where people encounter ideas, emotions, and possibilities that reshape their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. The question of whether Pokémon Tower is ultimately a place of sadness or hope cannot be answered definitively, as individual experience varies based on personal circumstances and psychological orientation. For some visitors, the concentration of death and loss creates an atmosphere of overwhelming sadness that makes the visit difficult to endure. For others, the tower represents hope through its demonstration that love and connection persist beyond death, that memory can preserve relationships even when physical presence ends. These contrasting experiences reflect the inherent ambiguity of memorial spaces, which simultaneously acknowledge loss and affirm the enduring significance of what has been lost. The tower's capacity to hold multiple meanings simultaneously makes it a particularly rich site for philosophical and existential reflection. A single visit might evoke sadness about a specific loss, gratitude for time shared with a deceased Pokémon, anxiety about future losses, comfort from observing memorial practices that provide structure for grief, and curiosity about supernatural phenomena. These different responses need not be reconciled into a single coherent reaction. The tower accommodates emotional complexity, allowing visitors to experience contradictory feelings without requiring resolution into a unified emotional state. The practices of lighting candles, leaving flowers, and speaking to the dead that occur throughout Pokémon Tower serve functions that extend beyond their explicit memorial purposes. These ritualized actions provide concrete activities for people struggling with abstract emotions, transforming vague feelings of loss into specific physical gestures. The actions also create temporal structure for grief, marking time through repeated visits and seasonal memorial observances. By providing both physical actions and temporal rhythms, memorial practices help mourners navigate difficult emotional terrain with tangible guidance that purely internal psychological work cannot always provide. The tower's relationship to broader questions about mortality and meaning reflects philosophical concerns that transcend specific cultural contexts. Every culture must develop frameworks for understanding death and practices for honoring the dead, and Pokémon Tower represents one community's approach to these universal challenges. By examining the tower's specific characteristics and the practices conducted there, we can gain insights into broader human concerns about impermanence, memory, and the search for meaning in the face of inevitable loss. The tower functions as both a particular cultural artifact and a window into universal existential questions. The role of silence and sound at Pokémon Tower creates acoustic environment that reinforces memorial atmosphere. Periods of silence broken by specific sounds, footsteps on stone, the distant cry of ghost-type Pokémon, wind moving through upper floor windows, create auditory texture that heightens awareness and emotional receptivity. The interplay between silence and sound mirrors the memorial process itself, where absence, silence, is punctuated by moments of active remembrance, sound. The acoustic environment thus becomes more than background setting, instead functioning as active participant in the creation of memorial meaning. The tower's windows and their relationship to natural light shape the interior atmosphere in ways that change throughout the day and across seasons. Morning light entering through eastern windows creates different emotional resonance than afternoon light or the complete darkness of night. These variations mean that visiting the tower at different times produces distinct experiences, and some regular visitors develop preferences for particular times of day when the light conditions feel most appropriate for their personal memorial practices. The natural light cycles remind visitors of ongoing temporal processes, connecting memorial activities to the broader rhythms of day and night, seasonal change, and the passage of years. The use of fire in the form of candles creates visual focal points and introduces movement into otherwise still environments. Candle flames flicker in response to air currents, creating small motions that draw the eye and provide objects for contemplation. The flames also produce warmth that can be felt when standing close, adding tactile dimension to the visual and auditory elements of the memorial environment. The impermanence of candles, which burn down and must be regularly replaced, mirrors the impermanence of life and provides gentle reminder of time's passage. These multiple functions make candles particularly effective memorial tools that engage visitors across sensory modalities. The scent environment within Pokémon Tower contributes significantly to its distinctive atmosphere. Incense creates dominant olfactory presence, with specific scents chosen for their associations with memorial practice and spiritual reflection. Beneath the incense lies the smell of old stone, aged wood, and the faint mustiness characteristic of spaces that are rarely exposed to full sun and fresh air. These background scents create olfactory signature that regular visitors come to associate strongly with the tower, and encountering similar scents in other contexts can trigger vivid memories of tower visits and the emotions associated with them. The tactile experience of touching stone walls, wooden railings, and memorial markers provides physical connection to the tower that complements visual and auditory engagement. The cool smoothness of polished stone contrasts with the rough texture of weathered wooden surfaces, and both differ from the varied textures of memorial objects left by visitors. These tactile variations create a kind of haptic landscape that visitors navigate through touch as well as sight. For visually impaired visitors, the tactile dimension takes on particular importance, providing primary means of experiencing the tower's physical character. The temperature of different surfaces within the tower varies based on material composition and exposure to sunlight, creating subtle microclimatic variations that attentive visitors can detect. Stone walls in shadowed areas remain cool even during summer, while wooden elements exposed to direct sunlight can become surprisingly warm. These temperature differences add another layer to the sensory experience of moving through the tower, with body awareness registering environmental shifts that might not reach conscious attention but nonetheless contribute to overall sense of place. The experience of ascending through the tower's floors creates a vertical journey that mirrors traditional narratives about spiritual ascension and the relationship between earth and sky. Moving upward away from ground level and closer to the top of the structure can evoke feelings of rising above ordinary concerns or approaching something elevated and significant. This vertical symbolism operates whether or not visitors consciously recognize it, shaping experience through spatial metaphors embedded in the architecture itself. The physical effort required to climb stairs adds to this sense of journey, with bodily exertion marking progress toward a destination that is both physical and symbolic. The descent from upper floors back to ground level creates a different experiential quality than the ascent, often feeling quicker and less ceremonial. This asymmetry between ascent and descent mirrors many pilgrimage traditions, where the journey to a sacred site involves different experiences and emotional states than the return to ordinary life. The descent can feel like a gradual re-entry to normal consciousness after the heightened awareness often reported by visitors to the upper floors. The architectural structure thus creates temporal narrative arc with distinct phases that shape how visitors process their tower experience. The boundary between Pokémon Tower and the surrounding town marks a threshold between memorial space and an ordinary civic life. Crossing this boundary in either direction involves subtle psychological shift as visitors move from one mode of being to another. Entering the tower requires adopting attitudes and behaviors appropriate to memorial contexts: quietness, respect, contemplative focus, while exiting allows gradual return to the emotional registers and social behaviors characteristic of everyday life. The management of this boundary crossing varies among individuals, with some experiencing sharp transitions and others finding the shift more gradual and blurred. The tower's relationship to the sky above it connects the earthbound memorial space to celestial realm in ways that carry both practical and symbolic significance. The eastern-facing window on the seventh floor frames sunrise, creating daily connection between the memorial site and cosmic cycles that dwarf human timescales. This relationship positions the tower within a larger cosmological framework where human and Pokémon lives are brief episodes in vast temporal progressions. The architecture thus encourages perspective taking that can provide comfort by contextualizing individual losses within grander patterns of arising and passing away. The materials from which Pokémon Tower was constructed, stone, wood, metal fittings, each have their own histories prior to incorporation into the structure. The stone was quarried from specific geological formations that took millions of years to form. The wood grew in forests that themselves were part of ecological communities extending back through time. These material histories that add temporal depth to the tower, making it a concentration point for multiple timescales from the billions of years of geology to the decades or centuries of human construction and use to the momentary flicker of individual lives. This temporal layering creates rich substrate for contemplation about time, permanence, and change. The tower's foundation extends below ground level into soil that contains the decomposed remains of countless organisms that lived and died over millennia. The boundary between the tower's constructed elements and the living earth beneath it is permeable, with moisture and minerals moving between them, roots finding their way into gaps in the foundation, and small organisms inhabiting the interface zones. This permeability reminds us that no structure is truly separate from its environment, that all human constructions exist in ongoing dialogue with natural processes that preceded them and will continue after they crumble. The tower is embedded in ecological and geological matrices that exceed human control and outlast human purposes. As we drift toward the quieter moments of reflection, the weight of what Pokémon Tower holds becomes clearer. This structure, built to honor those who have passed, continues to serve its purpose across generations, adapting to new needs while maintaining core functions that give it cultural staying power. The tower stands as testament to the bonds between humans and Pokémon, bonds strong enough to warrant formal memorial observance and careful preservation across decades. In recognizing what the tower represents, we encounter fundamental questions about how to honor loss, preserve memory, and maintain connection across the boundary between life and death. The stories contained within the tower's walls are countless, each burial representing a unique relationship, a specific life, and a particular grief. These individual stories aggregate into collective narrative about the role of Pokémon in human lives and the importance of honoring creatures who give so much to the people they accompany. The tower makes visible what might otherwise remain abstract, transforming ideas about loss and remembrance into concrete architectural and ritual forms that can be experienced directly rather than merely contemplated abstractly. The tower's future remains uncertain in some respects, dependent on continued cultural investment and practical support from communities that may have different priorities and values than those of previous generations. Yet the basic human need to acknowledge death and honor the dead suggests that some form of memorial practice will persist, and Pokémon Tower has demonstrated remarkable resilience across changes in technology, culture, and social organization. Its endurance suggests deep alignment between the site and fundamental human needs that transcend particular historical moments. The lessons offered by Pokémon Tower extend beyond memorial practice to encompass broader insights about living with awareness of mortality, cherishing relationships while they persist, and finding meaning in the face of inevitable loss. The tower teaches that death need not be hidden or denied, but can instead be acknowledged and integrated into full understanding of existence. This integration does not eliminate grief or make loss easier to bear, but it provides framework for processing difficult experiences without being overwhelmed by them. The tower models how communities can create supportive structures for navigating emotional challenges that every person eventually faces. The physical presence of Pokémon Tower will endure for some time yet, its stone and wood resisting decay through continued maintenance and cultural will to preserve. But the tower's deepest significance lies not in its physical structure, but in what that structure enables, the practices of memory and honoring that give meaning to loss. These practices could theoretically occur anywhere, but they happen here, in this specific place that generations have chosen to maintain. The choice to preserve and use Pokémon Tower reflects collective decision that such places matter, that physical spaces dedicated to memorial purposes serve irreplaceable functions in human and cultural life. The darkness that surrounds Pokémon Tower during nighttime hours creates different atmospheric conditions than daytime visits provide. The building's silhouette becomes more pronounced against the night sky, its vertical form emphasizing the distance between Earth and stars. Interior spaces, lit only by candles, take on qualities of mystery and depth that electric lighting would dispel. The darkness itself becomes participant in memorial experience, its presence reminding visitors of the unknown that death represents and the uncertainty about what, if anything, lies beyond the end of life. This darkness is not hostile, but rather contemplative, inviting reflection rather than fear. The morning light that eventually arrives brings renewal and reminds visitors that memorial work is not about dwelling permanently in grief, but rather about incorporating loss into ongoing life. The tower stands as it has stood for generations, witnessing countless individual griefs while itself enduring. The structure's permanence offers comfort to those experiencing losses that feel uniquely devastating, reminding them that others have suffered similarly and survived. This solidarity across time, mediated by the persistent presence of the memorial structure, creates connection between present mourners and all those who have previously stood in the same spaces grieving their own losses. The truth behind Pokémon Tower is that there is no single truth, but rather a complex interweaving of histories, practices, beliefs, and experiences that together create a place of profound significance. The tower is simultaneously a building, a memorial site, a habitat for ghost-type Pokémon, a cultural landmark, a tourist attraction, an architectural achievement, and a focus for ongoing debate about appropriate memorial practice. These various identities coexist without contradiction, each contributing to the tower's full meaning. Understanding the tower requires holding all these perspectives simultaneously, recognizing that different truths can be equally valid depending on one's relationship to the site and the questions one brings to it. There are places that carry the weight of all who have passed through them, places where the boundary between past and present grows thin enough that both seem to exist simultaneously. Pokémon Tower is such a place, holding within its walls the accumulated presence of everyone who has ever climbed its stairs to honor a loss. The tower will stand through more seasons, more years, bearing witness to griefs not yet experienced, and providing space for memorial practices not yet imagined. Until then, it remains what it has always been, a quiet monument to love that persists beyond death, and to the hope that remembering matters, even when those we remember cannot witness our remembrance. The seasons move across Pokémon Tower with visible rhythm, each bringing its own character to the memorial landscape. Spring arrives with new growth in the cemetery grounds, as flowers push through soil enriched by years of organic decomposition. The fresh blooms contrast with weathered memorial stones, creating visual dialogue between renewal and permanence. Visitors during spring often comment on this juxtaposition, finding in it either comfort or melancholy, depending on their personal relationship to the cycles of growth and decay. The ghost-type Pokémon seem less active during spring months, their manifestations becoming less frequent, though not entirely absent. Summer brings increased visitation as favorable weather makes travel to Lavender Town easier and more appealing. The cemetery grounds reach peak greenness, with grass and flowering plants achieving maximum growth before the heat of late summer begins to stress vegetation. The interior of the tower remains cool even during the warmest days, providing refuge from external temperatures and maintaining its characteristic atmospheric conditions. The contrast between the warm, life-filled world outside and the cool, contemplative interior becomes particularly pronounced during summer, reinforcing the sense of crossing a threshold when entering or exiting the building. Autumn is the season most strongly associated with Pokémon Tower in cultural consciousness and practical reality. Traditional memorial observances cluster in autumn months, following agricultural cycles that made this season appropriate for honoring the dead after harvest work concluded. The cemetery takes on golden and red tones as deciduous trees change color, and the rare white flowers that grow only in this location bloom during their brief window. Ghost type Pokemon activity increases noticeably, with sightings becoming more frequent and manifestations more pronounced. The reasons for this seasonal variation remain speculative, with theories ranging from temperature and humidity effects to cosmic or spiritual influences that peak during autumn. Winter transforms the cemetery into a stark landscape of bare trees and frost covered stones. Snow accumulation can make navigation difficult, and the tower's interior grows even colder than usual, with some areas approaching freezing temperatures despite the thick stone walls. Visitation drops sharply during winter months, with only the most dedicated mourners and caretakers venturing to the tower during harsh weather. This seasonal isolation creates a different quality of memorial experience, one characterized by solitude and the heightened awareness that comes from visiting a place when few others are present. The ghost type Pokemon remain active during winter, seemingly unaffected by temperatures that discourage most human visitors. The cyclical movement through seasons creates temporal structure for memorial practice, with certain activities and observances tied to specific times of year. Anniversary dates mark individual timelines of loss and remembrance, while seasonal festivals create communal rhythms that bring people together for shared memorial work. This layering of personal and collective temporal markers helps mourners navigate the extended process of grief, providing both private moments of individual remembrance and public opportunities for communal support. The tower's influence on dream life and unconscious processing has been noted by numerous visitors who report vivid dreams following their visits. These dreams often incorporate tower imagery, ghost-type Pokemon, or deceased Pokemon the dreamer knew in life. Some dreamers report experiencing communication with deceased Pokemon or receiving messages that provide comfort or closure. While such experiences resist empirical verification, their consistency across many independent reports suggests that the tower affects psychological processing in ways that extend beyond conscious awareness during the actual visit. The question of whether these dreams represent actual spiritual communication or purely psychological phenomena cannot be definitively resolved, and perhaps need not be. The dreams serve important functions regardless of their ultimate ontological status, helping dreamers process grief and integrate loss into their ongoing lives. The tower thus continues its memorial work even when visitors have physically departed, influencing emotional and cognitive processes that unfold during sleep and in the days following a visit. The children who grow up in Lavender Town develop distinctive relationships with Pokémon Tower, shaped by early and repeated exposure. For them, the tower is not exotic or unusual, but simply part of the landscape, as familiar as any other town landmark. This familiarity can produce either deep appreciation for the tower's significance or a tendency to take it for granted, treating it as background element rather than recognizing its exceptional character. Parents and educators in Lavender Town work to cultivate awareness and respect without overwhelming children with the weight of the tower's memorial purposes. The experience of losing a first Pokemon often marks a significant developmental moment for young trainers, and those who grow up in Lavender Town have immediate access to memorial resources that trainers from other communities must seek out or do without. The tower provides concrete support during a difficult experience, offering not just a burial site, but an entire cultural framework for understanding and processing loss. Young people who have this resource available often develop more sophisticated understanding of grief and death than peers from communities where such topics receive less explicit attention. The educational system in Lavender Town has developed specific curricula addressing death, loss, and memorial practice in ways unusual for elementary and secondary schools elsewhere in Kanto. These programs aim to prepare students for inevitable encounters with death while avoiding inappropriate exposure to content beyond their developmental capacity to process. The balance is delicate, requiring careful attention to individual children's emotional states and cultural backgrounds. Some parents appreciate the explicit educational attention to topics often avoided in school settings, while others worry about premature exposure to emotionally difficult material. The Tower's role in vocational training for caretakers, memorial practitioners, and Pokémon healthcare providers has grown over time as these professions have become more formalized. Apprenticeships conducted at the Tower provide practical experience with memorial rituals, building maintenance, visitor support, and interaction with ghost-type Pokémon populations. These training programs combine hands-on work with mentorship from experienced practitioners, transmitting knowledge that cannot be adequately conveyed through classroom instruction alone. Graduates of these programs often maintain lifelong connections to Pokémon Tower, returning for ongoing professional development or volunteer service, even after establishing careers elsewhere. The Tower functions as a professional network hub where individuals working in death-related fields throughout Kanto can connect with peers, share knowledge, and develop collaborative relationships. Annual gatherings bring together memorial practitioners, grief counselors, hospice workers, and others whose work involves supporting people through end-of-life experiences. These professional networks serve practical purposes, but also provide emotional support for workers in fields that can be psychologically demanding and socially isolating. The Tower thus supports not only primary memorial functions, but also the infrastructure of professional practice around death and grief. The artistic community has drawn sustained inspiration from Pokémon Tower, producing works that interpret and reinterpret the site across multiple media. Painters have created countless images of the tower in different lights and seasons, exploring its visual qualities and symbolic resonances. Photographers document the building's details and the activities conducted within it, creating archives that serve both aesthetic and documentary purposes. Sculptors have produced three-dimensional interpretations of tower elements, abstracting architectural features into forms that capture essential qualities while departing from literal representation. The literary engagement with Pokémon Tower includes poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction that uses the site as subject or setting. Poets find in the tower's memorial atmosphere material for contemplation of mortality, memory, and meaning. Fiction writers use it as backdrop for ghost stories, mysteries, and character studies exploring how people respond to loss. Memoirists describe personal experiences at the tower, contributing to a growing body of first-person accounts that document diverse relationships with the site. This literary production enriches cultural understanding of the tower while also making it accessible to audiences who may never visit physically. Musical compositions inspired by Pokémon Tower range from minimalist ambient pieces that evoke its contemplative atmosphere to elaborate symphonic works that interpret its historical and spiritual dimensions. Some musicians have incorporated recordings of actual tower sounds, footsteps, wind, distant Pokémon cries into their compositions, creating pieces that blend field recording with musical elaboration. These works often premiere at concerts held in or near the tower, creating site-specific performances that deepen connections between music and place. The interdisciplinary arts projects that combine visual, sonic, and performative elements have produced some of the most innovative engagements with Pokémon Tower. These projects might involve installation art within the tower's spaces, soundscapes that respond to visitor movement, or participatory performances that invite audience members to contribute to memorial rituals. The experimental nature of these works sometimes generates controversy, with critics questioning whether artistic innovation appropriately serves memorial purposes or instead exploits serious subject matter for aesthetic ends. The ongoing dialogue between artistic experimentation and memorial respect produces creative tension that keeps both evolving. The tower's influence on fashion and material culture appears in subtle ways throughout Lavender Town and beyond. Clothing designs incorporate purple tones associated with the town and tower. Memorial jewelry features motifs drawn from tower architecture, and home decor items reference the building's aesthetic qualities. These material culture expressions allow people to carry tower associations into their daily lives, maintaining connection with memorial themes even when not physically present at the site. The commercialization of tower imagery raises familiar questions about appropriate use of memorial symbols, though most expressions remain respectful rather than trivializing. The culinary traditions associated with Pokémon Tower and memorial observances include specific foods prepared for sharing during memorial services and offerings left for deceased Pokémon. These traditional foods often feature ingredients and preparation methods passed down through generations, connecting contemporary memorial practice with historical traditions. The sharing of food during memorial gatherings serves social functions of building community and mutual support, while also satisfying practical need for sustenance during emotionally demanding activities. Some families maintain recipes specifically designated for memorial use, foods prepared only when honoring the dead and thereby carrying special significance. The beverage traditions surrounding tower visits often emphasize tea and other warm drinks that provide comfort and create opportunities for contemplative pauses. The ritual of preparing and sharing tea introduces temporal structure into memorial visits, marking transitions between different activities or phases of grieving. The warm liquid offers physical comfort that complements emotional support from companionship and ritual practice. Some caretakers maintain tea service facilities within the tower, providing visitors with access to warm beverages and creating informal gathering spaces where people can rest and converse between memorial activities. The tower's relationship to technological change reflects broader cultural negotiations around how innovation should be integrated into traditional practices. Proposals to install advanced climate control systems that would better preserve the building's structure have met resistance from those who believe the tower's natural environmental conditions are integral to its character. Suggestions for comprehensive digital documentation of all grave sites would undoubtedly aid researchers and distant family members, but raise concerns about privacy and the commodification of memorial information. Each technological possibility requires careful consideration of benefits and costs, both practical and symbolic. The debates around these technological questions often divide along generational lines, with younger community members more willing to embrace innovation, while elders express concern about preserving traditional practices and atmospheres. These divisions are not absolute. Some young people strongly support historical preservation, while some elders welcome helpful innovations. But the pattern reflects broader cultural dynamics around technological change and tradition. Finding consensus requires extensive dialogue and willingness to compromise, accepting that no single approach will satisfy all stakeholders completely. The tower's accessibility for visitors with physical disabilities has improved over time through targeted modifications that preserve historical character while removing barriers. Ramp access to the ground floor allows wheelchair users to enter and experience the main memorial chamber, though upper floors remain inaccessible to those unable to climb stairs. Audio description programs assist visually impaired visitors in understanding architectural features and memorial objects they cannot see. Tactile maps and models provide alternative ways of experiencing the tower's spatial organization. These accommodations reflect evolving understanding of inclusive design and recognition that memorial spaces should be accessible to all who wish to pay respects. The linguistic diversity of visitors to Pokémon Tower has prompted development of multilingual interpretive materials that make the site's history and significance accessible to non Kanto language speakers. Written guides in major regional languages help international visitors understand what they are experiencing, while audio tours provide narration in multiple languages for those who prefer listening to reading. The translation work required to produce these materials raises interesting questions about how memorial concepts and practices translate across cultural and linguistic boundaries, revealing both universal patterns and culture specific nuances in how different societies approach death and remembrance. The tower's representation in virtual and augmented reality applications has created new ways of engaging with the site for people unable to visit physically. Virtual reality experiences allow users to explore digitally reconstructed tower spaces and participate in simulated memorial services. Augmented reality applications overlay additional information onto physical spaces when visitors view them through smartphones or specialized devices. These technological extensions of the tower experience generate enthusiasm among some stakeholders who see them as democratizing access, while others worry they dilute the significance of physical presence and direct engagement with the actual memorial site. The question of authenticity in virtual versus physical tower experiences touches on fundamental issues about the nature of memorial practice and what makes a memorial site meaningful. Does the significance reside primarily in the physical materials and location, or can it be adequately mediated through technological representation? Different philosophical and cultural traditions answer these questions differently, and consensus may be neither possible nor necessary. The coexistence of physical and virtual access options allows individuals to engage with Pokémon Tower in ways that align with their personal values and circumstances. The tower's role in supporting research about grief and bereavement has contributed to psychological and medical understanding of how people process loss. Studies conducted with tower visitors have documented grief trajectories, identified helpful memorial practices, and revealed individual differences in grieving styles. This research informs clinical practice in grief counseling and hospice care, improving professional ability to support bereaved individuals. The tower thus contributes to scientific knowledge while maintaining its primary memorial functions, demonstrating how heritage sites can serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The ethical considerations surrounding research conducted at memorial sites include concerns about privacy, consent, and the potential for research activities to disturb the memorial atmosphere. Researchers must balance their interest in gathering data against respect for visitors engaged in emotionally vulnerable memorial work. Best practices involve transparent communication about research purposes, voluntary participation with robust consent procedures, and minimization of intrusive data collection methods. These ethical frameworks protect both research participants and the integrity of the memorial site, while allowing valuable knowledge production to continue. The tower's influence on public health policy related to grief support and bereavement services has been substantial, with Pokémon Tower serving as model for how communities can create supportive infrastructure around death and loss. Policymakers studying successful grief support systems frequently visit Lavender Town to observe how memorial practices, community organizations, and physical spaces work together to support bereaved individuals. The lessons learned inform development of grief support programs in communities lacking established memorial traditions or dedicated memorial sites. Pokémon Tower thus functions as educational resource for improving societal responses to death and grief beyond its immediate geographic context. The tower's connection to broader environmental and ecological concerns reflects growing awareness of how human memorial practices impact natural systems. Cemetery expansion affects local ecosystems by converting habitat, altering hydrology, and introducing chemical inputs from preservation of bodies and maintenance of grounds. Sustainable memorial practices that minimize environmental impact have gained attention from community members concerned about ecological responsibility. These concerns have prompted exploration of alternatives such as natural burial, cremation with eco friendly scattering, and memorial forests where trees planted in honor of the deceased provide habitat and carbon sequestration. The relationship between Pokémon Tower and climate change adaptation planning involves considering how rising temperatures, altered precipitation patterns, and extreme weather events will affect the site's physical structure and surrounding grounds. Adaptation strategies might include improved drainage systems to handle increased rainfall intensity, structural reinforcements to withstand stronger winds, and selection of drought tolerant plant species for cemetery landscaping. These practical adaptations must be implemented carefully to avoid compromising historical integrity while ensuring the tower can withstand environmental stresses likely to intensify in coming decades. The tower's future in a changing climate requires long term planning that extends beyond immediate maintenance needs to encompass scenarios decades or centuries ahead. Rising temperatures may make the building's current climate uncomfortable for human visitors, requiring consideration of cooling systems that would alter the atmospheric qualities many people value. Increased severe weather frequency threatens structural elements and may necessitate protective measures that change the building's appearance. These challenges require difficult decisions about how much change is acceptable in service of preservation and what aspects of the tower are most essential to maintain, even if other elements must be modified. The cultural memory work performed by Pokémon Tower involves not just remembering specific deceased Pokémon, but maintaining broader historical consciousness about human Pokémon relationships across generations. The accumulated memorial markers create archive of these relationships, documenting how they have evolved over time and revealing patterns in how different eras have understood Pokémon roles and significance. This archival function makes the tower valuable to historians and sociologists studying long-term social change, providing primary source material about intimate relationships that often leave limited written records. The tower's role in intergenerational knowledge transmission extends beyond formal education to include informal learning that occurs when older community members share memories and traditions with younger people. Grandparents bringing grandchildren to visit graves of Pokemon the older generation new create opportunities for storytelling and relationship building across age groups. These intergenerational encounters help preserve knowledge about family history, local traditions, and the specific individuals whose lives are commemorated in the cemetery. The social learning facilitated by the tower strengthens community cohesion and maintains continuity with the past. The emotional labor required to maintain Pokémon Tower and support its memorial functions falls disproportionately on volunteer caretakers and professional memorial practitioners who must manage their own emotional responses while supporting others through grief. This work can be psychologically demanding, requiring emotional regulation skills and access to peer support networks that understand the unique challenges of memorial work. The community has developed support systems for memorial workers, including regular gatherings for debriefing and processing, access to mental health services, and clear boundaries around work responsibilities to prevent burnout. The tower's significance as a locus of collective memory positions it as a site where community identity is actively constructed and reconstructed across time. The stories told about the tower The practices conducted there and the meanings attributed to it all contribute to Lavender Town's sense of itself as a distinctive community with particular values and traditions. Changes to the tower or its surrounding practices therefore carry implications beyond the immediate functional concerns to touch on questions of community identity and continuity. Debates about tower management often reveal deeper disagreements about what Lavender Town is and should be, making even seemingly minor decisions potentially contentious. The tower's relationship to trauma and traumatic loss reflects its capacity to accommodate particularly difficult grief experiences. Families whose Pokemon died suddenly, violently, or under traumatic circumstances find in the tower a space where even the most painful losses can be acknowledged and mourned. The structure and ritual practices provide containing framework that helps people process overwhelming emotions without being consumed by them. The presence of others who have experienced similar traumas creates implicit solidarity that can be comforting even when no words are exchanged. The tower's role in supporting complicated grief, grief that becomes prolonged or intensified beyond typical patterns, involves providing ongoing memorial space for individuals who need extended time to process their losses. While most bereaved individuals gradually adjust to life without the deceased, some struggle with persistent, disabling grief that interferes with daily functioning. The tower offers these individuals a place to be with their grief without judgment, maintaining connection with their lost Pokemon while slowly working toward integration of the loss. The non prescriptive nature of tower practices allows for individual variation in grief timelines, avoiding pressure to move on according to externally imposed schedules. The tower's influence on how Lavender Town residents understand and discuss death has created a local culture where mortality is addressed more directly than in many other communities. Children growing up in this environment learn about death as a natural part of life rather than a taboo topic to be avoided. This cultural difference becomes apparent when Lavender Town residents interact with people from communities where death remains largely unspoken, with communication gaps emerging from different comfort levels with explicit death talk. The tower has shaped a local culture where death literacy is relatively high, equipping residents with vocabulary and conceptual frameworks for discussing end of life issues. The economic value generated by Pokémon Tower through tourism, research activity, and cultural production is substantial but difficult to quantify precisely. The tower draws visitors who spend money on lodging, food, and local goods, providing economic benefit to Lavender Town businesses. Researchers conducting studies at the tower sometimes receive funding that flows into the local economy through accommodation and supply purchases. Cultural producers inspired by the tower may generate income that has indirect connection to the site. These various economic flows contribute to the town's financial health while raising ongoing questions about appropriate balance between commercial activity and memorial dignity. The tower's function as a guarantor of community distinctiveness provides economic value beyond direct financial flows by making Lavender Town a recognizable and memorable place. In a region with many small towns competing for residents, tourists, and economic development, having a clear identity helps communities stand out and attract the resources they need to thrive. Pokémon Tower gives Lavender Town an identity that, while somber, is nonetheless distinctive and valued by those who appreciate the town's character. This branding value contributes to economic development in ways that extend beyond tourism to include attracting residents and businesses that align with the town's memorial-focused identity. The tower's influence on property insurance and risk assessment reflects its value as an irreplaceable cultural asset whose loss would devastate the community. Insurance policies protecting the tower must account for its historical significance. and the difficulty of replacement should disaster occur. The premiums for ensuring such a unique structure can be substantial, creating ongoing financial burden that must be balanced against the unacceptable risk of operating without adequate coverage. The insurance questions highlight the gap between the tower's cultural value and its financial value, as no amount of money could truly replace what would be lost if the building were destroyed. The tower's resilience in the face of various threats over its history demonstrates both the strength of its construction and the community commitment to its preservation. Natural disasters, structural deterioration, financial crises, and social change have all posed challenges that could have led to the tower's abandonment or destruction. The fact that it has survived reflects conscious choices by generations of Lavender Town residents to invest the resources and effort required for preservation. This track record of successful preservation provides confidence for the future while also reminding current stakeholders of the vigilance required to maintain what has been inherited. The tower's symbolic resonance extends beyond its literal function as a Pokémon memorial to encompass broader meanings about impermanence, legacy, and what persists after death. The building itself will eventually deteriorate beyond repair, despite all preservation efforts, yet it already has outlasted the lives it memorializes and will likely outlast those who currently tend it. This temporal relationship, the memorial outliving both the memorialized and the memorializers, creates poignant meditation on what endures and what fades. The tower persists as material object, but also as idea, cultural practice, and collective memory that may outlive the physical structure itself. The question of what should happen to Pokémon Tower when it finally becomes structurally unsound has no easy answer. Some advocate for reconstruction that would maintain the building's form while replacing failing materials. Others prefer allowing natural deterioration while documenting the process and preserving memories and practices in non-physical forms. Still others imagine radically different memorial approaches that might replace the tower with something more suited to future community needs and environmental contexts. These discussions remain largely theoretical, but will eventually become urgent as the building ages and preservation becomes increasingly difficult. The tower's relationship to the concept of sacred space illustrates how secular memorial sites can acquire quasi-sacred character through sustained cultural investment and ritual practice. While Pokémon Tower has no official religious affiliation and welcomes visitors of all beliefs, the reverence with which many people approach it and the ritual practices conducted there create atmosphere usually associated with sacred spaces. This demonstrates that sacredness can emerge through cultural practice rather than requiring explicit religious designation, and that memorial sites can hold profound significance even in largely secular contexts. As the hours grow quieter and contemplation deepens, the significance of Pokémon Tower crystallizes into clearer form. This place has served for generations as a container for grief, a framework for remembrance, and a bridge between the living and the dead. Its stones and wood, its rituals and practices, its ghosts and memories all combine to create something greater than the sum of components. The tower endures because it serves needs that do not diminish with time: the need to honor those we have lost, to mark their passing with ceremony and space, and to maintain connection even after death has severed physical presence. The dark truth behind Pokémon Tower is not a single revelation, but rather the accumulated reality of countless losses, each one unique, yet also connected to universal experience of loving and losing. The tower does not hide this truth, but instead displays it openly, acknowledging that death comes to all and that grief is the price paid for love. In this acknowledgement lies both sorrow and strange comfort, recognition that we are not alone in our losses, that others have walked this path before and survived, and that remembering matters, even when those we remember are gone. The morning rituals conducted at Pokémon Tower by dedicated caretakers begin well before most visitors arrive, creating a foundation of care that supports the day's memorial activities. Caretakers arrive in darkness during winter months, carrying lanterns that create moving pools of light as they ascend the stairs to begin their work. The first tasks involve checking candles throughout the building, replacing those that have burned down completely, and lighting new ones where flame has extinguished during the night. This daily renewal of light carries symbolic weight beyond its practical function, representing the persistence of memory and the ongoing commitment to honoring the dead. The sweeping of floors and dusting of memorial markers constitutes another essential caretaking practice, one that requires both physical effort and emotional attentiveness. The caretakers move through the tower's spaces with practiced efficiency, their movements quiet and respectful, even when no other humans are present to observe. The work creates a kind of moving meditation, the repetitive physical actions allowing the mind to settle into contemplative states that many caretakers describe as spiritually nourishing. The intimacy of this work, touching the same surfaces that mourners have touched, cleaning spaces where grief has been expressed, creates a profound sense of connection to the tower's memorial purpose. The checking of structural elements or for signs of new damage or deterioration happens during these early morning rounds, with caretakers noting cracks that have appeared, moisture that has infiltrated, or other issues requiring attention. This vigilance prevents small problems from becoming major structural failures, protecting the building through attentive maintenance rather than dramatic interventions. The caretakers develop intimate knowledge of the building's quirks and weak points, learning to read subtle signs that indicate developing problems. This embodied expertise cannot be fully captured in written maintenance manuals, requiring instead the experiential knowledge that comes from years of daily interaction with the physical structure. The preparation of ritual spaces for the day's expected memorial services involves arranging specific objects, ensuring adequate supplies of incense and candles, and creating environments conducive to the emotional work that will unfold within them. Different memorial traditions require different spatial configurations, and experienced caretakers learn to adapt spaces quickly to accommodate varying needs. This flexibility reflects the tower's role as a multi-purpose memorial site, serving diverse communities with different practices and preferences. The caretakers function as ritual specialists who understand the practical requirements of various memorial traditions and can facilitate their effective performance. The morning light entering through the tower's eastern windows creates particular atmospheric effects that caretakers have learned to appreciate and anticipate. The angle of sunlight changes throughout the year as the sun's rising position shifts along the horizon, creating seasonal variations in how interior spaces are illuminated. During certain times of year, the light strikes specific memorial markers or architectural features in ways that create visually striking effects, almost as though the building itself is highlighting particular elements for contemplation. Whether these effects result from intentional design or fortunate coincidence remains unclear, but caretakers have come to value them as special moments in the tower's daily cycle. The sounds of the tower in early morning differ from those heard during busier hours when visitor activity dominates the acoustic environment. In the quiet before opening, caretakers hear the building itself more clearly, the settling of stone, the creaking of wood, the movement of air through corridors and chambers. These sounds create a kind of ambient soundscape that many caretakers find calming and meditative. The occasional cry of a ghost-type Pokémon punctuates the quiet, reminding caretakers that they share the space with other inhabitants whose relationship to the tower is longer and deeper than any human tenure. The interactions between caretakers and the resident ghost-type Pokémon develop over time into something resembling mutual recognition, if not quite friendship. The Pokémon come to recognize individual caretakers, responding differently to familiar humans than to unknown visitors. Some ghastly and haunter seem to actively assist with caretaking work, moving small objects that have been displaced or drawing attention to areas requiring maintenance. Whether these behaviors represent intentional helpfulness or coincidental movements that caretakers interpret as assistance remains open to interpretation, but the apparent cooperation creates a sense of partnership in maintaining the memorial space. The knowledge that caretakers accumulate about the tower's history comes partly from formal documentation, but also from oral traditions passed between generations of workers. Stories about unusual events, remarkable memorial services, and the tower's role in community life are shared during work sessions and training periods, creating a living archive of institutional memory. This oral tradition preserves knowledge that might not appear in written records, including practical wisdom about how to handle difficult situations, which community members hold particular influence over tower policies, and where hidden structural problems tend to emerge. The emotional toll of caretaking work becomes apparent during particularly difficult memorial services, or when caretakers must deal with visitors experiencing acute grief. Witnessing others' pain day after day requires emotional resilience and the ability to maintain professional boundaries while still offering genuine compassion. Some caretakers develop spiritual or philosophical frameworks that help them process their constant exposure to death as in grief, finding meaning in their service and viewing their work as sacred calling rather than merely employment. Others struggle with the emotional demands and eventually move to different work, recognizing that not everyone is suited to the particular challenges of memorial caretaking. The physical demands of tower maintenance should not be underestimated, as the work involves climbing stairs repeatedly, carrying heavy supplies, and performing tasks that require strength and endurance. The building's vertical structure means that materials must be transported up multiple flights of stairs, as modern conveniences like elevators would compromise the tower's historical character. Older caretakers sometimes develop joint problems from years of stair climbing, while younger workers must build the physical conditioning necessary for the work's demands. The physical nature of the labor creates bodily knowledge of the tower, with caretakers learning its spaces through muscle memory as much as conscious thought. The seasonal variations in caretaking work reflect both practical necessities that's in traditional observances tied to the agricultural and memorial calendar. Autumn brings increased work preparing for the memorial festival and accommodating higher visitor numbers. Spring involves extensive grounds maintenance as plants emerge from winter dormancy and require pruning, weeding, and general care. Summer heat necessitates special attention to candle placement to prevent excessive melting, while winter cold requires monitoring for ice damage and ensuring visitors can navigate safely despite slippery conditions. These seasonal rhythms structure the caretaking year, creating predictable cycles of intense activity and relative calm. The training of new caretakers follows apprenticeship models that emphasize learning by doing rather than purely classroom instruction. Newcomers work alongside experienced caretakers, observing and assisting with daily tasks while gradually taking on more responsibility. The training period extends over months or even years, recognizing that developing the full range of skills and knowledge required for independent caretaking cannot be rushed. The apprenticeship also serves as an extended evaluation period, allowing both trainers and trainees to assess whether the match between person and position is appropriate before making long-term commitments. The caretaker community forms a distinct social group within Lavender Town, bound by shared experiences and responsibilities that others outside this work cannot fully understand. The caretakers gather informally to share meals, discuss tower business, and provide mutual support during difficult times. These gatherings create space for processing emotions and experiences that might be inappropriate to discuss in other contexts, allowing caretakers to speak frankly about the challenges of their work without fear of judgment. The bonds formed through this shared labor often last throughout lifetimes, creating networks of relationship that extend beyond the immediate tower community. The compensation for caretaking work is modest, reflecting the volunteer nature of much tower maintenance and the limited financial resources available for paid positions. Those who make caretaking their primary work often do so for reasons beyond economic gain, motivated by spiritual calling, family tradition, or deep personal connection to the tower's memorial mission. The financial challenges of sustaining oneself through caretaking work mean that many caretakers maintain additional employment or rely on family support, treating tower work as a form of service rather than career in the conventional sense. The recognition that caretakers receive for their labor varies, with some community members expressing deep appreciation, while others take the work for granted as simply part of how Lavender Town functions. Annual memorial festivals typically include acknowledgement of caretakers' contributions, providing public recognition that many caretakers value highly. However, the day-to-day work often proceeds without acknowledgement, requiring caretakers to find intrinsic satisfaction in their labor rather than depending on external validation. This dynamic reflects broader patterns in how society values care work, often underappreciated despite its essential nature. The specialized knowledge about ghost-type Pokémon that caretakers develop through daily exposure and interaction exceeds what most trainers or researchers accumulate. The caretakers learn to read subtle behavioral cues, indicating Pokémon emotional states or intentions, to recognize individual Pokémon within species that might appear identical to casual observers, and to predict when and where manifestations are likely to occur. This expertise makes caretakers valuable consultants for researchers studying ghost-type behavior, though the knowledge often resists translation into academic frameworks that privilege quantifiable data over experiential understanding. The relationship between caretakers and Lavender Town's municipal government involves ongoing negotiation around funding, policies, and the division of responsibility for tower maintenance. The volunteer caretaker organization maintains significant autonomy in day-to-day operations, but requires government support for major structural projects and navigating regulatory requirements. Tensions sometimes emerge when government officials unfamiliar with memorial work attempt to impose bureaucratic procedures that caretakers view as inappropriate for the tower's special character. Finding workable compromises requires patience and willingness from both sides to understand different institutional perspectives and constraints. The documentation that caretakers maintain about tower activities serves multiple purposes, creating historical records while also tracking practical information about maintenance needs and visitor patterns. Daily logs record which spaces were cleaned, which candles were replaced, which memorial services occurred, and any unusual events or observations. These logs accumulate over years into substantial archives that researchers mine for historical data about tower use and evolution. The writing style of the logs tends towards sparse notation rather than elaborate description, reflecting the practical orientation of the record keeping and the time constraints under which caretakers work. The personal relationships that develop between caretakers and regular visitors create networks of connection that support memorial practice. Caretakers come to recognize families who visit frequently, learning their stories and developing familiarity that allows for more personalized support during memorial activities. Some visitors form lasting friendships with caretakers, relationships that extend beyond the tower context into broader social life. These personal connections humanize the tower experience, transforming what could be impersonal institutional interaction into genuine human relationship. The succession planning for caretaker leadership positions involves identifying individuals with both technical competence and the interpersonal skills necessary for coordinating volunteer labor and representing the caretaker organization in community forums. Leadership transitions can be delicate, as outgoing leaders must balance their continued investment in the tower against the need to allow new leaders space to establish their own approaches. Successful transitions typically involve extended periods of shared responsibility, allowing incoming leaders to build credibility and relationships before assuming full authority. The archive of memorial markers and grave sites that caretakers maintain provides essential resource for families seeking information about deceased Pokémon interred within the tower. The archive includes maps showing burial locations, transcriptions of inscriptions that have become illegible due to weathering, and historical information about memorial practices during different eras. This archival work requires careful attention to detail and recognition that the information being preserved may become the only remaining record of specific Pokémon and their relationships with human trainers. The caretakers understand themselves as custodians not just of physical space, but of memory itself. The tower's basement level, rarely visited by casual guests, contains storage areas where caretakers keep supplies, tools, and archived materials. The basement also includes workshop spaces where minor repairs can be conducted and memorial objects can be prepared. The atmospheric conditions in the basement differ markedly from upper floors, with higher humidity and lower temperatures, creating environments that require different maintenance approaches. Some caretakers avoid the basement when possible, finding its isolated underground character unsettling, while others appreciate the practical work that can be accomplished in spaces removed from the ceremonial atmosphere of the memorial floors. The relationship between caretaking work and personal spiritual or religious practice varies among individual caretakers. Some approach the work from explicitly religious perspectives, viewing it as form of service aligned with their faith traditions. Others maintain secular orientations, understanding caretaking as cultural rather than religious labor. The tower accommodates both approaches, with its non-sectarian memorial character allowing space for diverse spiritual frameworks without requiring adherence to any particular tradition. This flexibility enables the caretaker community to include people with quite different worldviews who nonetheless share commitment to the tower's memorial mission. The physical exhaustion that caretakers experience at the end of long work days is accompanied by a particular quality of emotional and spiritual fatigue that comes from extended exposure to spaces saturated with grief. The work requires constant emotional regulation and the maintenance of professional composure, even when confronted with intense suffering. Some caretakers develop practices for releasing accumulated emotional weight at the end of shifts, engaging in activities that help them transition from the memorial context back into ordinary life. These transition rituals might include physical exercise, creative expression, time in nature, or conversations with understanding friends or family members. The question of when caretakers should intervene in visitor behavior and when they should remain unobtrusive requires judgment that develops through experience. Some situations clearly demand intervention: vandalism, dangerous behavior, harassment of other visitors, or ghost-type Pokémon, while others fall into gray areas where the appropriate response is less certain. Caretakers must balance respect for visitors' autonomy and the private nature of grief against responsibility for protecting the memorial space and ensuring appropriate conduct. Developing this judgment requires both explicit training and the accumulated wisdom that comes from encountering numerous ambiguous situations and learning from the outcomes of different intervention strategies. The stories that circulate among caretakers about supernatural experiences within the tower range from subtle phenomena that could be explained rationally to events that seem to resist any conventional interpretation. Most caretakers report experiences they cannot fully explain: objects moving without apparent cause, voices heard in empty spaces, the sensation of being touched by invisible presences. The interpretation of these experiences varies, with some caretakers convinced of genuine supernatural activity, while others remain skeptical despite their own perceptions. The community generally maintains tolerance for different interpretive frameworks, recognizing that the ultimate nature of the phenomena may be less important than the shared acknowledgement that the tower contains mysteries that exceed complete understanding. The tower's influence on caretakers' personal views about death and what, if anything, follows it reflects the profound exposure to mortality that the work entails. Some caretakers develop or strengthen beliefs in afterlife or spiritual continuity, finding in their tower experiences evidence for consciousness persisting beyond physical death. Others move toward more materialist positions, understanding death as final ending and viewing memorial practice as serving the living rather than the dead. The diversity of metaphysical positions among caretakers demonstrates that regular exposure to death and memorial practice does not produce uniform conclusions about ultimate questions. Instead, deepening individual inquiry along paths shaped by personal philosophy and experience. The annual memorial festivals bring periods of intense activity that test caretakers' capacity to manage complex logistics while maintaining the contemplative atmosphere essential to memorial work. The festivals involve coordinating multiple simultaneous memorial services, accommodating visitor numbers that exceed the tower's normal capacity, and providing support for emotionally heightened situations where grief might manifest in unpredictable ways. The successful execution of festival activities requires extensive planning and seamless coordination among numerous volunteers, demonstrating the caretaker organization's capacity for effective collective action. The festival preparations begin weeks in advance, with caretakers cleaning and decorating the tower, stockpiling necessary supplies, and rehearsing procedures for managing crowds and emergencies. The decorations for memorial festivals differ from those used during other times of year, emphasizing seasonal flowers and symbolic elements associated with honoring the dead. The aesthetic choices reflect careful attention to creating environments that feel both celebratory and solemn, avoiding the cheerfulness of typical festivals while still marking the event as special and different from ordinary days. The community meals that accompany memorial festivals serve important social functions, bringing together people who might otherwise remain isolated in their grief and creating opportunities for building supportive relationships. The meals feature traditional foods associated with memorial observances, prepared according to recipes passed down through generations. The sharing of food creates moments of connection and ordinary human fellowship that balance the emotional intensity of memorial services, providing necessary relief from concentrated grief work. Some of the most meaningful conversations and lasting friendships among mourners begin during these communal meals. The musical performances that occur during memorial festivals range from solemn instrumental pieces to vocal works that include traditional memorial songs and contemporary compositions. The music serves to create emotional atmosphere, facilitate collective emotional expression, and mark transitions between different phases of festival activities. Some performances occur within the tower itself, with the building's acoustic properties enhancing the music's emotional impact. Other performances happen in outdoor spaces adjacent to the cemetery, allowing larger audiences to participate while protecting the tower's interior from overcrowding. The children's activities included in memorial festivals reflect recognition that families with young children need programming that helps kids engage with memorial themes at age-appropriate levels. These activities might include creating simple memorial art, planting flowers in the cemetery, or participating in simplified rituals designed for children's shorter attention spans and different emotional capacities. The children's programming also provides parents with brief respites from the demands of managing their own grief while supervising children, creating space for adult mourners to engage more fully in memorial practices. The closing ceremonies that conclude memorial festivals create structured endpoints that help participants transition from the heightened emotional and spiritual state of the festival back toward ordinary life. These ceremonies typically include collective acknowledgments of the dead, expressions of gratitude for the memorial community, and forward looking statements about continuing relationships with those who have been lost. The ritual closure provides psychological container for the festival experience, marking it as a distinct period that has both beginning and end rather than allowing it to dissipate without clear boundary. The period immediately following major memorial festivals often brings emotional letdown for both caretakers and participants, as the intensity of the shared experience gives way to return to normal routines. Some people experience this transition as difficult, finding ordinary life flat and unsatisfying in comparison to the meaningful engagement of festival activities. Caretakers may feel exhausted yet also bereft, missing the sense of purpose and community that the intensive festival work provided. Recognition of these post festival emotional patterns has led to development of follow up gatherings and support structures that help people process their experiences and maintain connections formed during the festival. The documentation of memorial festivals creates historical record of these recurring events while also providing material for evaluating and improving future iterations. Photographs, videos, and written accounts capture the festival's visual and temporal dimensions, preserving information about who attended, what activities occurred, and how the events unfolded. This documentation serves both archival purposes and practical planning functions, allowing organizers to learn from past successes and challenges when designing subsequent festivals. The financial accounting for memorial festivals requires careful tracking of expenses and revenues to ensure the events remain sustainable. While some costs are covered by municipal support or donations, festivals also generate revenue through modest attendance fees, sale of memorial supplies, and fundraising activities. The economic model aims for self-sustainability while keeping participation accessible to people regardless of financial means. This balance requires creative thinking about revenue generation and cost management, avoiding commercialization that would compromise memorial dignity while ensuring adequate resources for high-quality programming. The evolution of memorial festival programming over time reflects changing community demographics, shifting cultural preferences, and emerging understanding of effective memorial practice. Elements that once formed central features of festivals may be retired as participation declines or community interest shifts, while new activities are introduced experimentally and retained if they prove successful. This evolutionary process keeps festivals responsive to community needs rather than locked into rigid traditional formats that may lose relevance as society changes. The regional reputation of Lavender Town's Memorial Festival has grown to the point where it attracts participants from throughout Kanto and occasionally from more distant regions. This growing attendance brings both opportunities and challenges, as wider participation increases the festival's cultural impact while also straining local infrastructure and potentially diluting the intimate community character that many longtime participants value. Managing this growth requires careful attention to capacity limits and conscious decision-making about whether and how to accommodate increasing interest. The tower's role as a site of pilgrimage for people seeking connection with the dead or exploration of spiritual questions has intensified as regional and international awareness of its character has spread. Pilgrims arrive with varying motivations, some seeking closure after traumatic losses, others pursuing paranormal experiences, still others engaging in general spiritual seeking without specific connection to Pokemon death. The tower accommodates this diversity of purpose while maintaining its primary memorial function, though tensions sometimes emerge when pilgrims' interests conflict with those of mourners engaged in private grief work. The notion of sacred pilgrimage applied to a secular memorial site raises interesting questions about the boundaries between religious and secular, sacred and profane. Pokemon Tower lacks official religious status, yet clearly functions as sacred space for many visitors who approach it with reverence typically reserved for religious sites. This liminal status allows the tower to serve diverse constituencies who might not share religious frameworks, but who nonetheless seek spaces that acknowledge dimensions of existence beyond the purely material and rational. The pilgrimage infrastructure that has developed around Pokemon Tower includes guidebooks, pilgrimage routes, and practices for preparing oneself for tower visits. Some pilgrims engage in preliminary fasting or meditation before arriving, treating the visit as significant spiritual undertaking requiring appropriate preparation. The pilgrimage routes might include stops at other memorial or spiritual sites in the region, creating extended journeys of which the tower visit represents the culmination. These practices transform casual tourism into intentional spiritual practice, even when the practitioners do not identify with traditional religious frameworks. The relationship between pilgrimage and tourism at Pokemon Tower reflects broader debates about authentic versus commodified spiritual experience. Pilgrims typically view their visits as qualitatively different from tourism, emphasizing sincere spiritual seeking over casual sightseeing. However, the practical distinction can be difficult to maintain, as even earnest pilgrims must engage with tourist infrastructure for transportation and accommodation. The tower's administrators generally avoid policing these boundaries, allowing visitors to define their own relationships to the site while maintaining behavioral standards that protect its memorial character. The commercial ecosystem that has emerged around Pokemon Tower pilgrimage includes businesses offering specialized services for pilgrims such as guided tours, meditation instruction, and memorial object creation. Some of these services align well with the tower's memorial purposes, enhancing visitors' experiences without compromising the site's dignity. Others edge toward exploitation, capitalizing on people's spiritual seeking or grief for commercial gain. The line between appropriate service provision and exploitation remains contested, with ongoing community discussion about which commercial activities should be welcomed, tolerated, or discouraged. The souvenirs and memorial objects sold in shops near Pokemon Tower range from tasteful memorial items that serve genuine commemorative functions to more questionable merchandise that treats the tower as generic tourist attraction. The most respected shops offer high-quality incense, candles, and memorial flowers along with carefully crafted items like memorial books, prayer beads, and symbolic objects with legitimate ritual purposes. Other vendors sell tchotchkes and trinkets of dubious taste, capitalizing on the tower's fame without regard for memorial appropriateness. Community members express varying tolerance for this commercial spectrum, with ongoing debates about whether stricter regulation would better protect the tower's character or represent inappropriate interference with free enterprise. The ethical questions surrounding memorial tourism and pilgrimage commerce touch on fundamental issues about commodification, authenticity, and the appropriate relationship between spiritual practice and economic exchange. Pure positions that would either completely commercialize or entirely prohibit economic activity both seem untenable, suggesting the need for nuanced approaches that allow appropriate commerce while limiting the most problematic forms of commodification. Finding this balance requires ongoing attention and willingness to adjust policies as circumstances change and new challenges emerge. The tower's influence on academic tourism brings researchers from various disciplines who study the site as an example of memorial architecture, grief practice, paranormal phenomena, or ghost type Pokemon ecology. This academic interest generates knowledge that enriches understanding of the tower, while also occasionally creating friction with community members who feel studied rather than genuinely engaged as collaborative partners. The most successful academic community partnerships involve reciprocal relationships where researchers contribute practical benefits to the community in exchange for access and cooperation. The photographic documentation of Pokémon Tower has created extensive visual archives spanning decades of the building's existence. Early photographs show the tower in earlier states of preservation, providing valuable information for restoration work and historical understanding. Contemporary photography captures current conditions while also serving artistic purposes, with photographers attracted by the building's dramatic visual qualities and atmospheric character. The photographic archive functions as both historical record and artistic corpus, demonstrating how documentation and aesthetic appreciation can serve complementary purposes. The restrictions on photography within certain areas of Pokémon Tower reflect concerns about privacy, respect for mourners, and protection of the contemplative atmosphere. Photographic activity can be disruptive, particularly when photographers treat the tower primarily as aesthetic subject without regard for ongoing memorial functions. The regulations attempt to balance legitimate documentation and artistic interests against protection of the memorial environment, allowing photography in some areas while restricting it in others. Enforcement challenges arise from the difficulty of monitoring all visitors and the blurred boundaries between acceptable and problematic photographic practice. The evolution of photographic technology from film to digital has changed how the tower is documented and represented. The ease of digital photography has produced exponential increase in the number of tower images, though perhaps with some decline in average quality as casual snapshots have largely replaced the more considered compositions typical of film photography. The proliferation of tower images across social media platforms has increased global awareness while also raising concerns about context collapse, where images shared without adequate explanation might misrepresent the tower's character or memorial purpose. The artistic interpretations of Pokémon Tower that appear in various media demonstrate how the site sparks creative imagination across disciplines and genres. Painters, sculptors, writers, musicians, and filmmakers have all drawn inspiration from the tower, producing works that range from realistic documentation to highly abstracted explorations of memorial themes. These artistic engagements introduce the tower to audiences who might never visit physically, extending its cultural influence far beyond Lavender Town's geographic boundaries. The question of whether artistic representation honors or exploits the tower and the grief it contains remains contentious, with different community members holding varying opinions about appropriate artistic engagement with memorial themes. Some welcome artistic attention as validation of the tower's cultural significance, while others worry that aesthetic appropriation trivializes genuine grief and suffering. These concerns intensify when artists from outside the community create work about the tower without deep engagement with local perspectives and values. The tower's appearance in horror and supernatural fiction has created popular image that sometimes overshadows its actual memorial character. Ghost stories set in or inspired by the tower emphasize frightening supernatural encounters, often sensationalizing paranormal elements while downplaying or ignoring the site's serious memorial functions. These fictional representations shape expectations that visitors bring to the tower, sometimes producing disappointment when the reality proves less dramatically frightening than the fiction suggested. The gap between fictional representation and lived reality reflects broader patterns in how popular culture transforms complex sites into simplified narrative tropes. The children's literature that engages with Pokémon Tower typically adopts more gentle approaches, using the site as setting for stories about coming to terms with loss, learning about death, or developing courage to face frightening but ultimately benign circumstances. These narratives serve pedagogical purposes, helping young readers process difficult themes in emotionally safe contexts. The best examples treat the tower with appropriate respect while still creating engaging stories that hold children's interest and attention. The academic literature about Pokémon Tower spans multiple disciplines and methodological approaches, from architectural histories to anthropological studies of memorial practice to parapsychological investigations of reported supernatural phenomena. This scholarly attention has produced substantial body of knowledge about the tower, while also sometimes creating tensions with community members who resist being treated as research subjects rather than active participants in knowledge production. The most valuable scholarship involves collaborative partnerships where academic researchers and community stakeholders work together to generate knowledge that serves multiple purposes and audiences. The tower's representation in educational materials for schools demonstrates how the site functions as pedagogical resource for teaching various subjects. Architecture classes study the building's construction and design principles. Social studies curriculum uses the tower to explore topics related to death practices, cultural diversity, and community identity. Science classes might examine ghost type Pokemon ecology or the building's environmental characteristics. Literature courses could analyze the tower's appearance in various texts. This educational utility extends the tower's influence into classroom contexts far removed from its physical location. The virtual reconstructions of Pokemon Tower, created for various digital platforms, attempt to make the site accessible to people who cannot visit in person. These digital models range from simple 3D representations that convey basic spatial relationships to elaborate virtual reality experiences that aim to recreate the tower's atmospheric qualities. The technical challenges of capturing the building's character in digital form are substantial, as many elements that contribute to the tower's impact temperature, scent, the quality of light and shadow resist straightforward translation into virtual environments. The question of whether virtual experience can adequately substitute for physical presence at memorial sites remains philosophically and practically unresolved. Digital advocates argue that virtual access democratizes memorial participation, allowing those separated by distance, disability, or financial constraints to engage with important cultural sites. Critics contend that memorial practice fundamentally requires physical presence and bodily engagement with actual spaces and objects, suggesting that virtual representations can supplement but never replace embodied experience. The debate reflects broader cultural negotiations around the relationship between physical and digital existence. The tower's future in an increasingly digital world may involve hybrid models that combine physical and virtual elements, allowing for new forms of memorial participation that transcend traditional spatial limitations. Imagine memorial services where local and remote participants gather simultaneously, with digital technology enabling distant mourners to participate in real time, while physical attendees occupy the tower's actual spaces. These hybrid possibilities raise questions about presence, authenticity, and the nature of memorial community, challenging assumptions about what memorial practice requires and enables. As contemplation deepens and the night extends its quiet presence, the accumulated weight of everything Pokémon Tower represents settles into clearer understanding. This structure has endured because it serves needs that persist across changing times and technologies. The need to honor loss, to mark passing with ritual and space, to maintain connection even after death, has created separation. The tower stands as architectural argument about what matters in human life, asserting through its very existence that relationships with Pokemon merit formal memorial recognition and sustained cultural investment. The tower's silent testimony speaks across generations, connecting present mourners with all those who have previously climbed these stairs carrying their grief. The stone steps, worn smooth by countless footfalls, bear physical record of this accumulated presence, each slight depression a marker of passage and pilgrimage. Walking these stairs means joining procession that extends backward through time, placing one's feet where others have stepped in their own journeys through loss and remembrance. This temporal connection creates solidarity that transcends individual isolation, reminding mourners that grief, however personally devastating, is also universally shared. The flowers that wilt on memorial altars teach their own lessons about impermanence as and the necessity of renewal. Fresh blooms are offered, they flourish briefly, they fade, and they are replaced by new offerings, an endless cycle that mirrors the larger patterns of life and death the tower commemorates. The wilting flowers are not failures, but rather honest acknowledgments of natural processes, demonstrations that nothing living persists unchanged, and that beauty and meaning can exist even within cycles of arising and passing away. The practice of bringing fresh flowers creates ongoing relationship with memorial sites, requiring repeated visits and sustained attention rather than single acts of commemoration. The candles burning throughout the tower create points of light in darkness, metaphors made literal through ritual practice. Each flame represents an individual memory, a specific life, a particular relationship being honored. The flames flicker and dance, responding to air currents and the movements of visitors, creating the impression of living presence within spaces dedicated to the dead. When candles burn down completely and their light extinguishes, new candles take their place, continuing the illumination in cyclical renewal that suggests both loss and continuity, ending and persistence. The incense smoke, rising through the tower's chambers, creates visible flowing movement in otherwise still air, marking time's passage through space. The smoke ascends toward upper floors and eventually dissipates, disappearing into the building's stone and wood, just as the dead have disappeared from visible world, while leaving traces in memory and in the memorial spaces dedicated to honoring them. The scent of incense lingers longer than the visible smoke, creating olfactory memory that persists after the immediate experience has ended, much as the influence of relationships with deceased Pokémon continues to shape lives long after physical presence has ceased. The inscriptions carved into memorial stones represent human attempts to make memory permanent, to resist the inevitable fading of individual details into generalized recollection. The stone's durability promises longevity that human memory cannot match, creating the hope that names and relationships will be preserved even after those who personally remember have themselves died. Yet even stone erodes eventually, and inscriptions become illegible, demonstrating that no memorial is truly permanent and all attempts to preserve memory must eventually yield to time's erosive effects. The ghost-type Pokémon that inhabit the tower exist as liminal beings, neither fully present nor entirely absent, neither completely alive in conventional sense, nor definitively dead. Their existence poses questions about the boundaries between life and death, of the possibility of consciousness persisting beyond bodily dissolution, and the nature of the spirit or soul that might survive physical ending. Whether these Pokémon represent literal persistence of deceased individuals or simply natural creatures that thrive in memorial environments remains theologically and philosophically contested, with different observers reaching different conclusions based on their prior metaphysical commitments. The tower's capacity to accommodate multiple interpretive frameworks without requiring consensus demonstrates a kind of epistemological generosity unusual in contemporary culture. Visitors can approach the tower from materialist perspectives that understand death as final ending, from spiritualist views that believe in consciousness continuing after bodily death, from religious frameworks that incorporate specific doctrines about afterlife, or from agnostic positions that acknowledge uncertainty about ultimate questions. The tower welcomes all these approaches, functioning as multivalent space where diverse beliefs can coexist in relative harmony. The silence that often pervades the tower's upper floors creates acoustic environment conducive to introspection and contemplation. In the absence of external noise, visitors become more aware of their own breathing, heartbeat, and internal mental activity. This heightened self awareness can facilitate meditation and the kind of inward turning that grief work sometimes requires. The silence is not empty, but rather full, saturated with the presence of all who have visited and all who are commemorated, creating a quality of attention and awareness that differs markedly from ordinary consciousness. The tower at night takes on different character than during daylight hours, with darkness amplifying both the building's mysterious qualities and visitors' emotional responses to the space. The candles become primary light sources, their warm, flickering glow creating intimate zones of illumination within larger fields of shadow. The ghost-type Pokémon grow more active and visible in darkness, their manifestations more pronounced and sustained. The boundary between imagination and perception becomes more porous, with visitors uncertain whether the movements glimpsed at the edge of vision represent actual entities or tricks of light and shadow playing upon psychologically primed awareness. The experience of being alone in the tower overnight, a privilege granted only to certain caretakers and occasionally to individuals conducting extended memorial vigils, provides intense encounter with the building's character and one's own psychological depths. The isolation and darkness strip away many of the comforts and distractions that buffer ordinary consciousness, creating conditions where suppressed emotions and unacknowledged fears can surface. Those who undertake such vigils often report profound experiences of grief, connection, and occasionally transcendence, though whether these experiences represent genuine spiritual encounters or psychological phenomena remains open to interpretation. The dawn that eventually arrives after a night vigil in the tower brings not just light, but a quality of renewal and hope that can feel miraculous after hours of darkness and intense emotional engagement. The first light entering through eastern windows transforms the tower's spaces, revealing familiar features that had been hidden or distorted by darkness. The transition from night to day mirrors the movement from acute grief toward acceptance and integration, suggesting that even the darkest nights eventually give way to morning. This daily renewal offers metaphor for recovery from loss, demonstrating that time continues its movement and that darkness, however deep, is not permanent. The tower's continued existence in a rapidly changing world represents a form of resistance to contemporary demands for constant innovation and progress. The building stands largely unchanged, while the society around it transforms, offering stability and continuity in the face of relentless change. This stability can be both comforting and frustrating, depending on whether one values tradition and continuity or prefers adaptation and innovation. The tower's preservation reflects a collective decision that some things merit protection from the forces of change, that not everything should be subject to the logic of improvement and modernization. The question of what happens when the current generation of caretakers ages out of active service and must be replaced by younger people with different relationships to tradition and technology will test the tower's resilience and adaptability. Will new caretakers maintain current practices with minimal modification, or will they introduce innovations that change the tower's character in fundamental ways? The answer will depend partly on the training and socialization that younger caretakers receive, and partly on their own values and creative impulses. The transition represents both risk and opportunity, threatening disruption while also potentially enabling evolution that keeps the tower relevant for new generations. The tower's meaning ultimately resides not in its stones and wood, but in the practices and relationships that animate the physical structure. A building without the memorial rituals, the caretaking labor, the visitor pilgrimages, and the community investment would be merely an old structure of historical interest but limited contemporary significance. The tower lives through ongoing use and sustained cultural attention, requiring active participation rather than passive preservation. This understanding emphasizes that cultural heritage is not static inheritance, but rather dynamic process that each generation must actively maintain and renew. The relationships that the tower facilitates between mourners and their deceased Pokemon cannot be empirically verified, but possess a subjective reality for those who experience them as genuine connection. Whether these relationships involve actual communication with spirits or represent psychological processes that feel like external encounter matters less than their functional role in helping mourners maintain meaningful connection with those they have lost. The tower provides the space and framework within which such relationships can be cultivated and honored, serving purposes that transcend questions about literal versus metaphorical truth. The tower's lessons about mortality extend beyond specific losses to encompass broader recognition of life's impermanence and the preciousness that impermanence creates. Knowing that all relationships will eventually end through death or separation makes present moments more valuable, encouraging attention and appreciation for what exists now rather than deferring engagement until some future time that may never arrive. The tower teaches this lesson not through abstract philosophy, but through concrete encounter with accumulated loss, demonstration that endings are real and inevitable and must be faced rather than denied. The hope that Pokémon Tower offers is not the false reassurance that death is not real or that loss can be avoided, but rather the more difficult and honest recognition that grief can be survived, that communities can support mourners through their darkest moments, and that memory can preserve something essential about relationships, even when physical presence has ended. This hope acknowledges pain while refusing to be defined entirely by suffering, maintaining space for meaning and connection even in the face of profound loss. The future that awaits Pokémon Tower remains uncertain in many respects, dependent on decisions not yet made and circumstances not yet arisen. The building will continue to age and require maintenance. The culture around it will continue to evolve, and each new generation will make its own choices about how to engage with this inheritance from the past. What seems certain is that as long as Pokemon die and humans grieve, there will be need for spaces like this tower, places where loss can be acknowledged and memory preserved. The quiet that settles over Pokemon Tower as night deepens carries the accumulated weight of all the silences that have preceded it, all the moments when words failed and only presence remained. In this silence lives everything that the tower represents: love that persists beyond death, community that supports individual suffering, ritual that provides framework for chaos, and memory that resists the erasure of time. The tower stands as it has stood, bearing witness to the eternal cycle of life and death, offering space for grief and remembrance, holding the dead close while the living continue their journey through time. Thanks for listening. Another story waits in the darkness. Let it find you before sleep comes.